All right, at this point, we will be beginning our second panel on the state carbon policy, and I will let our moderator introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. My name's Greg Dotson. I'm with the University of Oregon School of Law, and I'm moderating this panel. I hope you found Kristen Sheeran's comments as interesting as I did. It's really interesting as we see this multi-year process unfold to get a state climate policy in place, and I think getting that update from her was I certainly appreciated it, and I hope you did too. So in this panel, we're gonna talk more about where we stand on that issue of getting a state climate policy, and specifically on efforts to establish a market-based approach to drive down emissions. We've heard this morning so much of the world has already done this, including a significant part of the United States. Oregon has a clear intention to do so, and we have the perfect set of panelists to give us an update on where we stand on these issues. To my immediate left is Meredith Connolly. She's the Oregon Director of Climate Solutions. Sitting next to her is Nancy Hamilton, who's the co-director of the Oregon Business Alliance for Climate. And to my far left is Dylan Cruz, who's the Policy Director for Sustainable Northwest. They each have extensive and interesting backgrounds. It's all listed in the programs that you have, and I encourage you to take a look at that to learn more about their backgrounds. So I'm going to get the conversation started with a few questions, and we'll have a little moderated conversation. We'll be sure to save some time for questions at the end. Meredith, let's start with you. So we heard a lot about Oregon energy policy and climate policy this morning. Oregon really does have a proud history of innovative response to climate change. We've heard a lot about, the state had established the first fee on new generation facilities based on their carbon emissions. It's long been a leader on prioritizing energy efficiency. In the early 2000s, the state established the Energy Trust of Oregon to help drive down energy demand and boost clean energy supply. And since 2007, the state has been considering legislation to set an overarching and declining cap on statewide releases of carbon pollution to sort of harness market forces and drive that pollution down. As Kristen Sheeran explained, since then we've seen a lot of additional activities on climate change. Statutory goals for pollution cuts, clean fuel standard, increasing requirements for renewable energy, coal to clean bill, strong commitment to the deployment of electric vehicles. But the requirement for a declining cap on emissions has remained elusive. So I'm wondering if you can sort of help us understand why it has been elusive for these past 10 years and is now different.
Well, I will attempt to explain with the recognition that others have worked on this for far longer and have some institutional knowledge there. I think what we've seen is Oregon has set these greenhouse gas goals 11 years ago now, and so that set a real vision for the state and a recognition of where we need to go to do our part on reducing emissions. But despite best intentions, voluntary actions and some of the sector-specific policies we've had are not getting us there alone, and there needs to be a way to make those goals mandatory and get us on track. And so that's where I think all this energy and attention has been spent on passing something like the Clean Energy Jobs Bill that would set up a cap and invest program for Oregon. I think the three big shifts I see in momentum that I think make it really exciting and necessary are, one, climate change is now here. For a long time, it felt like this far-off threat. It was going to affect other places before Oregon. Now it's here. We're having summers with droughts and wildfires, and we are seeing sea level rise in our coastal communities and shellfish depleted through ocean acidification. Our summers, again, we just heard that the snowpack is way down in Oregon, and unfortunately, we're looking at really low stream flows for the summer again, which will affect our farms and increase wildfire risk again. And I think that really has made it hit home that we need to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gases here in Oregon if we are going to do our part to help solve this crisis and also build up resilient communities here in Oregon in the face of this threat. So we need to, so that I think is one, it's very tangible. We're not having the silly debate about if it's happening, it's what we do about it. I also think the federal government, unfortunately, is now actively working against the climate progress we've made. And so, you know, there's, speaking of the climate debate being real or not, you know, with the repeal of the Clean Power Plan, pulling out of Paris climate accords, now rolling back our clean car standards, there was this, I think, a bit of delay here in Oregon because we felt like, can we handle this at the national level, the federal level? That would be the place to do it, and we'll just wait. And now we really know it's on the states. Acting at the state level and the regional level is the biggest way we can actually approach this problem. So that has certainly turned all eyes to Oregon and what we're going to do here. And then the third is now, since we've been taking our time, carbon pricing is not a new idea, and there are many places that have passed this policy, and there's a proven track record. So there is, you know, there are 11 other states in the U.S. who have a price on carbon. The EU has a long-standing program. Canada is under a mandate to pass a price on carbon across its country. And now, even if Oregon passes a program that starts in 2021, China and Mexico will already have cap-and-trade programs in place before we do. So while we like to think of ourselves as a leader, and we do have a strong history there, we're not at the cutting edge of this, but I think we still have the opportunity to be one of the early adopters and capture a lot of those benefits, but that puts a lot more urgency on action now, and luckily we can see that you can decouple emissions from economic growth and how to design a program that really works for Oregon.
Yeah, that's great. I think just this past week, the International Energy Agency came out with their annual carbon emissions report, and they showed globally GDP is decoupling from emissions. And that comes upon, you know, state-specific data that's already happened in California. It's happened in the Northeast. And so I do think that that's a trend that's emerging. Nancy, let's turn to you. You're with the Oregon Climate Alliance, Business Alliance for Climate, I'm sorry.
That's right.
And your organization is new on the scene. You know, you weren't, I don't think your organization even existed a year and a half ago. And so, and yet in that short period of time, you've managed to collect a really impressive set of members, and you're obviously vocal and you're active. Can you tell us sort of who are your members and what unites them?
Well, thanks for having us here. Yeah, we didn't exist a year ago. We were actually founded in June of 2017. And when we launched actually out in Bend, someone referred to us as a pop-up C4, which we thought was kind of funny. And I think what we found was that large businesses who comprise the bulk of our membership now, we're up to almost 75 members. We have Vigor, Skanska, Nike, New Seasons, Dutch Bros, large businesses who have business not just here, but nationally and often internationally, felt that it's important to come together with a business voice around how do we price carbon, how do we create, Kristen talked a little bit about this, certainty and predictability. Businesses of that size tend to want to know what's going to happen rather than keeping things, you know, sort of in the here and now. And so folks started coming to us saying, we want to be part of this conversation. We think the time is now. I was Governor Kulongoski's senior policy advisor for economic development, and we were talking about this 10 years ago. And so, as Meredith said, this is not new. And I think the businesses who've been really attracted to our core mission, we're sort of tired of the conversation and really ready to make a change and move it forward legislatively. You know, there are some things that bring us together as a group that I think have helped us become a centerpiece of this conversation. We have a core mandate, which is to create a space for business to discuss what carbon policy looks like and how it can improve our economic vitality in the state of Oregon. A lot of people say, why, you know, how can you do this with less economic damage? And I'm always baffled by that, because someone from an economic development perspective, I see opportunity just everywhere. And if we don't start moving towards those innovations now, we'll be left behind. And Oregon has a long, proud history of leading on the green energy economy and showing that you can be good stewards of your place and be strong economically. So I think we found this sort of common bond among large businesses who see opportunity in that front. I think there are a few key things that have guided our work in the last year. We worked very hard in the 2018 short session to try to move this forward, and while it didn't pass then, we don't see that as failure. We see that as just forward movement. This takes, hard things take a long time. And we're very excited about the 2019 session and the governor's commitment and the Joint Legislative Committee. And we have some key principles that we keep in mind as we look to what a cap and invest a piece of legislation would look like. We have linkage to other markets. So someone earlier today talked about the Western Climate Initiative. I think actually it was one of your questions to somebody on another panel. We think that's really important because it creates economic opportunity for our businesses. We also believe that it's important that some of those reinvestment dollars go to innovation and economic opportunity. And we also agree very strongly, and Kristen talked about this in her comments earlier today, that we mitigate the impact on our rural communities, our communities of color, and our low-income fellow Oregonians, because they are often the first and most impacted by this. And we believe there's a way to create opportunity that doesn't nail those folks who can least afford it. And so those are the core principles we're really looking at as we move forward now with the efforts in 2018 heading towards the 19th session.
Great. So picking up on your theme about opportunities and also Meredith's point about extended wildfires, which I would think was obviously not an opportunity but a negative. Just in the fall, we hosted a symposium here, and Richard Whitman of the Department of Environmental Quality gave a presentation, and one thing that he talked about, which has really stayed with me, is that we now have a strong scientific basis to understand that if we fail to address climate change, we could lose the Northwest forests essentially by the end of the century. That really is sort of a heart of an Oregonian issue, and doesn't even go into the short-term issue of more intense or extended fire seasons. But Dylan, this brings us into your wheelhouse. I know you focus on the role of working lands and what they mean to rural communities. And how do you assess the challenges and opportunities associated with this issue?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And I think a lot of this conversation has actually been teed up really nicely by Kristen's comments earlier, by Senator Dembro. Nancy and Meredith have said. It's pretty obvious, climate change is here. We see it, reduced snowpack, less than 30% down in southern Oregon right now. Obviously, the wildfire season, prolonged and increased instances of drought, ocean acidification. It is very real and present in our lives. We talk about this a lot from a natural resource standpoint, obviously, as it relates to conservation values and natural resource services. But I could put a little bit of a different spin on that from an economic standpoint. In Oregon, $16.4 billion recreation economy. That's 172,000 jobs in the state. We have a $1.2 billion fishing economy, supports 11,000 jobs. We have an $8.2 billion agricultural economy, 34,000 farms, 98% of which are still family-owned. Forest products industry is the largest in the country, 60,000 direct jobs. We talk about the costs of action all the time when we're talking about carbon pricing. How is this going to affect my business and my bottom line, and what is that impact going to be from an economic standpoint? We have to start talking about the cost of inaction. Because when you look at those economic outputs and you look at those jobs, both direct and indirect, we are a natural resource-based economy in the state of Oregon. It is our strategic and comparative advantage. And it's time to seriously start thinking about inaction, because as we continue to see these impacts to those industries, that means job loss. That means reduced GDP. That means fewer dollars for services. And we're ultimately going to be spending significantly more trying to adapt to those impacts and recover those job losses and that lost economic output than we ever would from establishing a comprehensive price on carbon. to get to the opportunity standpoint, for our organization, a comprehensive price on carbon and comprehensive carbon policy, I don't think it's ineffective to say you shouldn't be including natural resources in this. I think it's impossible to say we can't find a role for our natural and our working lands within this conversation. And some of this was outlined a little bit earlier, but from an opportunity standpoint, this is a sector, our forests, our ag, our fisheries, that is not proposed to be covered under this existing legislation, so it is only opportunities in front of us. And that can come from a variety of places, and what we're ultimately trying to do when we talk about our natural working lands is three things. One, evaluate and provide a valuation on those services and those resources different than commodity production. Two, help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change so that those farmers and those ranchers and those forest workers can continue doing their jobs and maintain the status quo. And then three, provide voluntary incentives, not regulatory incentives, to do things differently and to do your work in a way that helps the state meet its carbon sequestration and adaptation goals. And most of the time, it's practices that are already proven and are already in place, and it's about providing the investments to just do more of it. So Kristen talked about a few of those examples, but when we've looked at the bill and things that we really like, we talk about things like offset markets. We talk about an opportunity to not just grow timber, but to grow carbon, right? Or we can do direct investments. We can provide incentives to our farmers for no-till management practices, or use of cover crops, or increase buffers along streams. We can do the same thing on the forest side. We can increase rotation lengths. You're producing both more timber as well as more carbon, so it's a win-win in that case. And people will say, well, isn't this going to change the bottom line for these folks? They're already working on the margins. We've got plenty of working examples in other jurisdictions where this is happening. In California, they have something called the Healthy Soils Initiative, where they provide those very incentives to their farmers to do just that. I will pay you X to do this practice on your property. California Farm Bureau supports it. They keep continuing to farm in the largest agricultural state in the country and have new revenue streams for their farmers, right? We talk about offsets. Well, if we're locking trees up for carbon, doesn't that mean that there's fewer logs for the mill? No. In California, employment in the manufacturing industry went up in the last 5 years. Board feet stayed the same. It's just another revenue stream for what you're doing. So there's significant challenges to our rural communities and to our natural resource economy here in the state, but the solution to those problems is locked within the very resources and those communities. We have to harness them differently, invest in them, and actually bring them into this conversation. That's legitimate equity, to inform this and think about how we're moving together and we're lifting all boats. But it's oftentimes practices that we're already doing, and it's within our grasp. It's just a matter of deploying it and recognizing those values differently.
So there's been a number of references to other states, and Senator Dimbro, I appreciated his comments, which he said, from his perspective, the country's looking to Oregon now to say what's going to happen. And I was wondering, from an environmental perspective or business perspective, if you feel the gaze from afar, and how's that manifesting itself here in Oregon?
Yes. Hello. There we go. I know for a fact that others are watching what Oregon is doing and looking for leadership here to set the tone for whether other states can step up and take on this challenge in a similar way and what that looks like. And from the perspective of being a small state and having an impact beyond our borders, in acting on climate, it is to our advantage to inspire action beyond our borders as well as do what's best for Oregon. And so I know that we talk about a green wall here a lot, and we know that Washington is looking at a price on carbon. California has one, British Columbia has one, all of Canada and Mexico will. So we are really that next part of that wall could be solidified with that legacy by passing a cap and invest program that shows that we're serious about curbing our greenhouse gases too, and really doing it in a way that provides incredible opportunity for the state.
Green wall instead of a green bottleneck, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I would add a few things. From an economic development business perspective, the businesses who choose to start here, stay here, and grow here are part of this sort of Oregon DNA that is different than what we have as business cultures in other places around the country and around the world. And our capacity to lead and innovate is part of what makes us great. And our really close relationship to nature here. I mean, and Dylan talked a lot about our natural resource-based economy, but you know, if you're recruiting people to work anywhere in the state, you talk about, oh, you can go to the coast and do this, or you're an hour from skiing, or you're a couple hours from hiking in the high desert. And if everything's on fire or droughted to death, you know, well, where's that going to take us just on a really baseline from an economic development perspective? It's part of what draws really smart, thoughtful people to here and to stay here. And so just from a baseline economic development perspective, that's a big deal. Quality of life is a huge recruitment factor for large businesses. But I think even more so, we have a history of innovating. We've created things that, you know, I mean, Phil Knight made the waffle shoe and transformed outdoor, you know, apparel as a result of starting with a running shoe. We love that. That's part of who we are. And we have an opportunity right now that's fascinating to me from an economic development perspective. Right now, it's cheaper for large polluters to pollute. And if it becomes cheaper to innovate, they'll innovate. Because the bottom line is that large businesses owe their bottom line to their shareholders. And so if it becomes less expensive to figure out how to install scrubbers on something or do a closed-loop system instead of emitting out into the air, business does this. And it's one of the reasons that the Alliance for Climate is very focused on a cap and invest model rather than a tax. Taxes are always either too high or too low, and they're static. A cap and invest model allows the market to decide how to respond to this issue. And we know that especially large businesses want to keep their bottom line down. And we have an extraordinary history of making new stuff in this state. Let's bring it to bear to reduce our state's carbon emissions. And the opportunity to marry those two things to us is just an extraordinarily exciting moment. It doesn't scare me at all. Like Dylan was saying, our members are terrified of inaction and the cost of that inaction, directly and indirectly, and to our industries and to our style of quality of life. And you know, my final comment on that front would be that Oregon, a lot of other states are looking to us right now, since there is such a dismal failure at the federal level to address this issue. We, unlike California, which is huge, it's the 8th largest economy in the world, they're sort of they're sort of unto themselves. Oregon's sort of a normal size. Somebody called us, it was Senator Dembrow, I think, who called Oregon normal. And so other states our size that have legislative structures similar to ours are going, how are they going to do this? You know, the Reggie states are now looking at going economy-wide. How's Oregon going to do this? If we fail now, shame on us. We've done all the work, we've done all the research, we are beyond ready for this. We're thrilled that both the legislature and the governor's office are interested in having not just an environmental voice at the table, but a business voice at the table to get us over that finish line.
Great. And Dylan, what kind of reaction are you hearing from rural communities with the message you're delivering? And is that something that you think also rural communities from other parts of the country are looking to us?
Yeah, and it's mixed, right? But it all depends about how you approach the discussion. I talk about climate change all the time. We talk about water storage. We talk about having enough water for agriculture and enough water for fish. We talk about drought issues. Obviously, with the wildfire season, we talk about forest health. We talk about wildfire management. We talk about renewable energy policy, distributed energy. We talk about resilience in the event that there is a catastrophic event. We talk about the productivity of working landscapes, succession planning, how we're going to maintain these working lands, and what revenue streams we're going to have for this. And I never say the word climate change. And you can't. I mean, you can't, right? And that's just the reality of it. You are dealing with communities, and there are people that I want to talk about climate change. I want to say it, but a lot of people just don't. But they absolutely want to talk about the impacts that they're feeling. We talk about adaptation more than anything, and people are much more comfortable with that concept because they see it and they feel it, and it's where they live, and it's impacting their bottom line. I think that's been a challenge, honestly, within the legislative process for us, is to think about this idea of mitigation and what happens in the future and a price on carbon and reducing our emissions. But what nobody disagrees on, whether it's in the building or it's in Burns, Oregon, is that we're feeling the impacts and we have to do something to address them. And we have to adapt to that. And that is the sweet spot where we are able to have productive conversations. And the other thing that everybody agrees on is there is a severe lack of investment and resources to do anything about it. A lot of legislators say, well, you know what, we're a drop in the bucket, why should we pay for anything? Well, that's fine, but we are sinking and drowning in the ocean. And that's not going to change. And so are we just going to allow that to happen to us, or are we actually going to make the investments and find a mechanism to do that and get serious about the impacts that we're feeling and what it means for our food and our fiber and our drinking water in this state? And so it is all about the message. The other thing I guess I would just add to that is, we talk about natural resources, we talk about revenue, we talk about the utility model. The elephant in the room in this conversation is certainly transportation. Rural communities, people drive. They're really worried about gas prices. And that has been something that has been sold to them by legislators, that this is going to crush you. This is a difficult message that we need to think about and advocates need to think about. And how are we, one, mitigating the message that gas prices are going to increase as a result of carbon pricing, which is just not true because it didn't happen in other jurisdictions because it's a globally traded commodity. But two, how are we thinking about other investments in rural areas, particularly related to transportation infrastructure that can both decrease our emissions, improve people's quality of life and livability, and result in some increased dollars and jobs in these communities? But that is something that comes up a lot in my conversations when we actually start talking about climate policy, and I don't think we should shy away from it. I think we need to take it head on. We need to be honest about those impacts and to say, yeah, we have to pay for these resources, but you're sick of the impacts that you're seeing in transportation infrastructure as well, and this is absolutely a priority for you. So rural communities are not just thinking about their farms or their ranches. It is a significant part of their economy, but they are very savvy about the bigger picture, and we need to respect that and respond to it as well. But we're having the conversation. People welcome it. We have to meet them where they are, and there's a lot of good ways to do that. It's about listening effectively and approaching with the right message and being respectful.
I want to pick up on something you just said, sort of the reference that people say, oh, Oregon's just a drop in the bucket on the emissions. And when I feel that the conversation has changed the way Meredith reflected upon it earlier, and you just look at the panel of energy people from this morning, no one was saying, oh, well, there's no way we're going to get carbon reductions. It was a question of how do we create regulatory structures that develop those solutions and get those solutions into place. Increasingly, you don't hear that from either the transportation sector or the energy sector, that there are not solutions, and yet you still hear it as a political argument that we're a small part of the global amount of emissions. That's just a fact. But is that really an argument that we shouldn't do our share? Maybe that question is leading.
That is not the first time I have heard that question, believe it or not. It is a often repeated political talking point, I would say, more than I think what most people understand and think. But it's, you can pick your analogy for why it matters if everyone takes responsibility for their own pollution in their own backyard as part of the broader picture. But it's certainly, if multiple people are dumping chemicals into a stream, and you stopping dumping your chemicals in that stream won't solve the pollution in the stream by itself, but should you not stop doing that only because two others are, and if you can do it effectively, will that inspire them to do the same thing? I can continue throwing litter out of your car. I don't think that I would let my kids take that argument of, we're just one car. It's okay if we throw our Burgerville bag out the window. It's kind of an amazing argument to me, especially knowing what we know about the science. And reducing greenhouse gases here matters because you're pulling it out of the atmosphere across our borders too. And it also matters because the more we do earlier on, we actually can bend the needle on baking in these impacts in the longer term. And what we are the first generation, I believe it was President Obama said it really eloquently, we're the first generation who are actually feeling the impacts of climate change, but can still do something about that. And that's not true for future generations. We'll be baking in even worse impacts if we don't do more now. And so it's a moral imperative, but it's also feasible, and it's time to do our share in Oregon. And I think I grew up here. A lot of us take that really seriously. Most of us, knew to clean up our own campsite. Or again, I got to work on my analogies. But it's true. That is kind of that argument I think falls flat for most people based on how they think of their state.
Yeah, I would offer just a little footnote to that, which is, we passed the bottle bill. We passed the beach, public beach, clean beach bill. This is who we are. And it would just, as I said, just shame on us if we can't do this on carbon. And so it's the right thing to do. It's what Oregon is known for. And also, carbon doesn't recognize state lines. We are bearing the burden of carbon emissions from China and India, and they are bearing the burden of ours. And we need to all be in this together. And as I said a moment ago, I think Oregon is really going to play a pivotal role in getting other states to fall in line. You get these tipping points. Everything's really, really hard to get going for a while. I mean, some of us have been working on this for a really long time. You start to see it move really fast. We need to take advantage of that. And Oregon needs to continue to push that very aggressively, because I think we're going to start to see exponential growth of carbon policy pricing across the United States as a result. So it's not just about our carbon.
So just from the brief exchanges that we've had so far in this panel, you can see that there are many different areas of priorities among stakeholders on this bill. For example, Nancy, a member of your group, may not have exactly the same priority as Dylan is focused on. Doesn't mean they're oppositional, but it does mean that it's a different set of priorities. So Meredith, I know you're sort of trying to think through strategy and around this bill, and I was wondering if you had anything that you could sort of share as you wrangle towards a consensus among a large group of stakeholders. How do you approach that, this sort of the sprawling nature of priorities among different groups as you try to put a large coalition together?
Yeah, it certainly hits on, because I think it is one of the most attractive aspects of a cap and invest type system. Is there's some basic frameworks that have to line up, especially if you want to link to a regional market. But then you can truly tailor this policy in many different ways to uniquely situate with Oregon's policies that are on the books, our economy and our industries and our rural areas and communities. And how you design it does lead to a lot of perspectives. Of course, it's regulating greenhouse gases from our biggest sources across our economy. So that brings, by nature, many different sectors to the table in the transportation and utilities and industrial sectors who have real skin in the game for how it is shaped and what it looks like. And then, of course, our rural areas are bearing, and many of our low-income and communities of color are bearing the brunt of climate impacts, and need to have a seat at the table to be determining how this is structured to make sure these investments are driven in their communities, and that it's not regressive, and that it's truly transformative for those areas as we all transition into this clean energy economy, and make sure everyone comes along. And so, the Renew Oregon Coalition is one big coalition that's been that we're a part of, that has been fighting for this, and we have members from small farms and small businesses and environmental groups and environmental justice, labor, faith leaders, you name it. And so there are a lot of perspectives on exactly what that looks like, but I think there are some broadly shared outcomes too. Everyone wants to see this get us on our state greenhouse gas goals and drive down emissions. And everyone wants to make sure that our economy is thriving in this low carbon future, and that low income Oregonians are not harmed and actually supported through it. And that we're driving this, this is the clean energy economy is one of the most jobs intensive sectors you can create. And so how are we really supporting that and making sure that those benefits are driven to every corner of Oregon. And I think if we get that right, we will have a pretty good policy on our hands, and then we can kind of get to that next level of policy detail where I think there will be some robust debate around. So that'll be where I think a lot of these conversations will take us to get those kind of final details right.
I think a similarity I've seen, the principles you've just articulated, the ones Nancy talked about, the one that Kristen Sheeran mentioned earlier, they seem to be economically focused, and and I obviously, as someone who's learned about these policies in the past, this is an economic tool. So I guess one point I just want to draw out is will this bill solve every issue? Do you think that there's room for this bill to solve every issue related to climate? Is this going to be an ongoing process?
Yes.
No.
Stay on message.
Senator Dembro, I will be asking. No, I will be back. No, unfortunately, I think Kristen actually said it really well. There is no silver bullet solution to climate change or to building a clean energy economy. And if there were, I think there may be actually broad consensus on just doing the one thing that got us out of this kind of dire situation we find ourselves in. So where we see this playing a role is really setting that broad framework, making sure that we are, our emissions went up between 2014 and 2016 in the transportation sector. So we're not only not driving them down the way we know we need to, they're actually increasing. And we see a role for a policy like this that can actually show that we're serious about our emissions and starting to bend that trajectory, and doing so in a way that drives out what are the least cost ways to get there. What we've seen with this market-based mechanism in place elsewhere is it's been less expensive and more successful to actually achieve the goals, and so I think that is something that is really incredible for here. If we can set that market, that actually lets a market work and is flexible, and if it's desired to link, that links this broader trading market, and then figure out how gentle of a transition do regulated entities really need. How are we accelerating decarbonization, and whether these investments should prioritize those biggest greenhouse gas reductions or go to adapting to the impacts we already have baked in, and where's that sweet spot between those priorities, I think will be an important discussion.
Great. And I should throw in that academic studies suggest it can be half as expensive to do a market-based approach rather than direct regulation as a way to get emissions reductions. And I think that is as we think about effects on low-income consumers, that's an important thing to keep in mind. So Nancy, the legislature won't convene now for a year, nearly a year. What are you planning on doing in the intervening time to get ready for that event?
Well, it seems like it's right around the corner, so less than a year feels really soon. But I think there are a few things that we're going to be doing with the Alliance for Climate, and I know others out in the sort of growing coalition of folks who want to get this responsible cap and invest legislation passed in 19 are going to be doing. For us, we want to continue to grow our membership. So if any of you represent large or medium-sized businesses, you want to join the Alliance for Climate, it's pretty cheap. Helps pay my bills so my kid can eat and stuff like that. Well, we'll be also traveling around the state, so we want to make sure that we're talking to folks everywhere. We want to get industries that are more diversified than what we have. We want more agricultural and timber representation. We want manufacturing representation. We'd like regulated entities to be members of our alliance. There's an adage that's, if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. And I think some folks really feel some inevitability about the movement on this, and we want this to be responsible. Like I said earlier, carbon doesn't know state lines, and we don't want business to move because we put a cap and invest legislation in place. We want a glide path that's responsible and thoughtful. We want jobs to stay in Oregon. And we need to be out around the state having this conversation with folks. I'm sometimes asked, what's your biggest opposition? And, there are folks who are opposed to this. But I think our single biggest point of opposition has been fear. And people are afraid of change. It's just common human nature to not want change. And the further we get away from the Portland metro area and low unemployment, which we have here right now, and we move into high unemployment areas and poverty, communities of color, and folks who are living in very, very rural communities. I worked with Chris Perry, who's in Fossil. I think he said there's a person per mile out there. You get 3 new jobs in that region. That's a big deal. Dylan and I worked on a juniper project, and people were like, well, it's only going to be 8 jobs. I'm like, do you know what difference that makes out in some regions? So people are terrified that this is going to create job loss. And the more we have these conversations around the state and have them in a framework like Dylan was saying, in ways that make sense to folks in different places, that's really, really important. If we can mitigate fear, we can get forward movement. So we're going to be doing a lot of that. We're going to continue to meet with legislators around the state. I think it's much more important to meet with folks in their districts, with their constituents. It's a really different dynamic once everybody's in Salem in the building. It's like a culture unto itself. And so we want to talk to folks at home. And we want to help them understand where there are opportunities in those districts for economic vitality and to mitigate those economic impacts that people are afraid of. We also are looking forward to engaging with the new Carbon Policy Office and working closely with the Governor's Office. We've had a couple of conversations with Kristen Sheeran already. We're excited that she wants our voice in the mix, and that's going to be a big deal. We're anxiously awaiting the makeup of the Joint Legislative Committee because we want to ensure that we're having thoughtful and substantive discussions with the members of both the House and the Senate who will be representing that work moving forward. And we want to do all of that in pursuit of coming into the building at the beginning of the 19th session with more folks who understand what we're doing, more businesses who've said, you guys are the voice we want to be part of, and getting the backs of our legislators who are ready to support this, and the governor who is ready to support this. So that's our work. We've got a lot of work cut out for us. We're excited about it.
Great. And Dylan, you were evoked. You've obviously talked some with communities, rural communities. So far, are you planning on doing more of that in the run-up to 2019?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and just to the point that Nancy was making, 8 jobs in Wheeler County reduces unemployment by 20%. Crazy. But you know what? 8 jobs is enough to keep a school open. That stuff matters. I've really appreciated that opportunity as part of this conversation, is that this has been a launching point for all of these major social unspoken things, these elephants in the room. And to be able to have these conversations with rural communities and people and really get down into the details about the impacts on their life and their fears and their hopes and their dreams and the farm that they own or the forest land that they own, what the future of it's going to be and how we make it work. And to be able to share that with legislators and the governor's office and be able to hear them say in kind that they get it. And that's been such a frustrating point for so many people for so long. I mean, to Nancy's point, whatever you want to call it, the forgotten people, the silent majority, whatever. People are afraid, and they have that fear, and they just want to be heard. And they just want to participate in the process. And they're sold a bill of goods that this is going to ruin their lives. And as soon as you sit down and you actually spend the time in their district, in their communities, with those individuals, not their trade reps, not the associations that give them a bad name in Salem and claim to represent 60,000 members, 59,000 of which maybe have never spoken to those reps and feel very differently about what's actually happening on their farm or their property. That dynamic changes. And every good thing that we've been a part of in Salem or in Washington, D.C., that has resulted in significant landmark change in finding a bipartisan agreement on a difficult natural resource-related issue has been a result of the process that Nancy's talking about. So yes, we will be going around, we will be working with people, we will be getting specific. I'm glad we're doing additional analysis, and there are, some additional studies we need to do. We've kind of studied this one to death. And the same people that always talk to me about analysis paralysis and too many numbers and no more feasibility studies and no more study bills keep asking for them. We really know what's going to happen. We've got the best and the brightest people in the world working on it, and we've got some of the best resources and workforce in the world to do something about it. And it's time to give those people an opportunity to participate in that process and get to work on it. I've been very pleased with the direction we've gone with the legislation to streamline the governance process. I like that we're funding existing programs that people already know about, that they're familiar with. That's the conversation I'm having with people. Oh, this whole climate change thing, it's going to be this giant giveaway to a bunch of special interest green groups. No. You already get payments from the federal government through the Natural Resource Conservation Service to do cover crops on your property. Now, we would like to add an additional state incentive. Are you on board? The soil doesn't really care what color the money is. We hear that all the time. So we got to get specific. We got to bring it down to the level where people are at. We have to acknowledge their fears. And we've got to make sure that they, as individuals and businesses, are willing to come forward and commit to that and own it and speak up publicly for the first time about it. And that is really our goal, is to say, step up, own it, put your cards on the table, say what you want, and be a part of this, because this is a collective effort, and we have to start treating it that way.
And Meredith, you, just to complete the ensemble, what is Climate Solutions planning in the next run-up to 2019?
Yeah, we're definitely prioritizing getting the Clean Energy Jobs Bill over the finish line in 2019, and we'll be actively engaged as a stakeholder in these processes. It's definitely been some wind in our sails to have the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and the Governor all come out and commit to this and say that it's time to get serious about this issue and get this done and set up a process. We're waiting for some of the details on what exactly that process looks like, but I think it's incredibly exciting to bring everyone to the table and work through shaping a really good policy for Oregon, and one that can get done and get started by 2021. And that was a commitment that really meant a lot to us, was setting things up in the interim so that the policy would still take effect by 2021. Again, unfortunately, the climate doesn't care that it takes a long time to deliberate through the legislative process, and one more year doesn't seem to matter for government processes as much as it does for our ecosystem. So we're really happy that things are lined up to still start by 2021 and capture a lot of those first mover advantages for capturing some of the opportunity side of this policy. So we'll be working with our, in coalition with the Renew Oregon Coalition, and working with all of the broad groups who, hearing their perspectives, making sure this bill, is strong and has environmental integrity and works for Oregonians in wherever they sit. And so that's going to be, rolling up our sleeves and doing a lot of work there. But we're excited about it.
Great. Well, let me just ask one last question. Actually, it's not one last question, but a question of all of you, which is, if you sort of had one message that you wanted policymakers or the public to hear about this, this is your shot, because they will all hear it based on this live cast that we're doing.
I guess I'll just say that even though there is a lot of momentum and things are teed up, there's no sure bets, and especially when you're going up against, we've actually already seen a dark money group called Priority Oregon come up, and won't reveal who they're funded by, but this regulates someone owned by Koch brothers, and the oil companies are certainly paying attention, and we have some theories of who's behind it, and it's going to be a fight still to get it done, and people need to know, legislators need to hear from you that this really matters and this is a priority, and that you want them to do this. And so going to town halls, calling and emailing them, joining our Renew Oregon Coalition if you want to get emails and know when to come to lobby day and show up. That all really matters, and we need people to show up in force. So we're happy to come talk to folks about, work through the details. There's certainly a couple of those, and whatever people need to understand and feel engaged in the process, and understand how this helps move the ball forward. And then we can also talk about what's next and what we'll be knocking on the door on next, because there will always be more to do, but this gets us a long way down the field.
I would have a core thing I would like to say to policymakers is, Those of you who've expressed your support, I'd like to say thank you. We have a lot of folks who've stepped up already and have really been critical to getting us where we are and getting us so poised for 2019 and a success there. I'd particularly like to thank Senator Dembro and Representative Helm, who have been just champions of this. And also the governor's office and Kristen Sheeran in particular. I'd also like to thank Senator Courtney and Speaker Kotek for agreeing to co-chair this joint committee going into 19. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that some folks have been here with us for quite a while. And I would also like to say to the policymakers out there who either still don't know what we're talking about or are afraid or are concerned for their constituencies, please reach out to us. We represent 75 large and medium-sized businesses from all over the state, and we want to talk to you. I already know what people think who agree with me. I need to understand where your concerns are so that we can make sure they're addressed responsibly in this work that's going to happen between now and then. So please, please reach out to us. And then to the public, show up and talk to your legislators. Let them know you've got their back and that you support this sort of important legislation in Oregon. Those would be my core messages.
There's no way out. I said the gang's all here. Let's have a party, right? Everything that Nancy said is spot on. What I love about Oregon politics is it's small enough that you can make a difference. You can really plug in, right? I mean, people look at this and they just think about this morass in D.C. and an army of lobbyists and money, and I can never get access. Senator Dembro will meet with you. Maybe not everyone, but Senator Dembro will meet with you. That's awesome. Go see your legislator. Make a phone call. Send a letter. You have outsized influence in the state of Oregon, and the world is watching. A little state like Oregon, plus California, plus Washington, plus Canada, plus all the other states, it's a domino effect. And the pendulum swings back, and people are really frustrated right now about a lot of things, and this is an actual opportunity to do something meaningful about it, to make some noise and push the pendulum back in the other direction. And you know what? It's been a sincere, legitimate process. I know there's a lot of tokenism that happens. Oh, yeah, come in. We want to hear. We care about your concerns. It's serious. We would not have so many work groups and so many task force and so many committees and be changing Kristen's life if they weren't serious about getting this right. It has been a legitimate conversation that has been open, transparent, and focused on equity and making this work for urban Oregon and rural Oregon and everyone in between. And this is a great, comprehensive chance to do something meaningful that touches so many people's lives and pulls so many levers, and everyone should play their role and participate in it. It's a global problem, it's a local solution to a global problem. We can do it. We have to start now. We've got a brief window of opportunity. Let's get serious, and let's actually do it. Why not?
Great. I'm hesitant to keep going after that, but I'm going to take some questions from the audience in just one moment. And before I do that, I have one last question for Meredith. Reference was just made to Washington State. I know Climate Solutions has a presence up in Washington as well. Senator Inslee, Governor Inslee deserves a lot of credit for putting that squarely on the agenda, and unfortunately did not get across the finish line. And so I was just wondering if you could bring us up to date on what's happening with our neighbor to the north.
Sure, I can. The update of what's happening in Washington is that's true. There was a big effort to get a carbon tax passed through the legislature in Olympia that failed. And so a lot of organizations across from labor and environment and environmental justice and tribes are tired of waiting for the legislative process to catch up, and so they filed a ballot initiative. They're gathering signatures now to pass a fee on carbon that would then be invested in greenhouse gas reductions and some adaptation. And so that is, like I said, in the signature gathering, expect to see it on the ballot this fall, and there's a lot of energy. People are incredibly excited about it. So it's true, Oregon may unfortunately be the last to join the party on putting a meaningful price on carbon, even by passing it next year. But that's okay. Timbers beat the Sounders. Half and half. We can catch up and and be the leaders in our own way if we pass it.
Spoken like the true Oregon State Director. All right, let's turn to the audience now and see if we have any questions for our panelists. Anyone?
Answered them all.
I'm sorry, over here. Dave.
Well, if you could use the microphone and speak up, because the people on the
On the
live stream
stream, yeah.
can't hear.
Thanks. Dave Antoff, energy consultant again. So you've touched on, I think, a little bit. Really good, first, excellent comments from all three of you. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Could you give a little bit of maybe context to the audience as to what, if this passes, why does it matter from sector perspective? You mentioned fuel briefly, Dylan, but from a transportation perspective, from a electricity perspective, I don't think that came out too much in the comments. But how's this going to matter?
Sure. True. So the way the program is set up is by putting this cap on our greenhouse gas emissions. The largest sources of greenhouse gases in our state will have to hold permits for each ton of pollution, and then they can trade them or reduce emissions or buy allowances or buy offsets, and they can choose the least cost way to comply as the cap comes down and there are fewer permits and as the price of those permits move up. And that's kind of how that market is put to work. And then, of course, there's the investment side and how you then spend those dollars. That is the other side of the coin of achieving those overall goals. So in the electricity sector, we have heard, rightfully so, some great credit to the Coal to Clean bill that was passed and getting coal out of our electricity mix and getting to 50% renewables by 2040. So there has been some good work done there, and this is truly complementary to that work done. We don't have a price on gas and the other fossil in the mix. And there, I believe it was the battery storage company earlier today said, there is not a level playing field yet, and that is one more tool there to truly be bringing a level playing field by making those externalized costs of carbon internalized on those products. And also the grid has, and our electric utilities have a huge role to play in decarbonization across our economy. That is where we have the technology already to be operating at almost a zero carbon capacity, and we can be dramatically accelerating that decarbonization if we can structure this policy to be doing that as we move the transportation and building use loads to the electric grid at the same time. That certainly helps us across the state achieve our goals at least cost. And then in the transportation sector, that is where that is the toughest nut to crack from a carbon reduction standpoint in general. And I think Kristen actually spoke to this really eloquently because of all the different sources and how you structure it. So I think there's putting a hard cap on our transportation emissions is really critical there and something that doesn't exist. We need to be accelerating the market for our decarbonized fuels and electrification in addition to our low carbon fuel standard. And again, it's really complementary because you're just saying, we have to get to these end goals and we'll let you market determine how to get there. Then we can figure out what are those least cost reductions that will happen. And some of those complementary programs on the books help drive down reductions to a certain point and set the markets to work within specific sectors to actually achieve that broad goal.
If I could just offer another thought on that front. We haven't talked really much today about, we're coming from the presumption that people understand what cap and trade or cap and invest models look like, and so thank you, Meredith, for offering some context for that, because we live in this little wormhole sometimes, and we assume everybody's in there with us, and hopefully you're not. You have a life. But the other side of this coin is also that for this regulation of this 100 or so big polluters who are emitting 25,000 metric tons or more a year of carbon, there will be revenues brought into the state. And on the transportation sector, it's an interesting conversation because almost all of our fuel is from out of state, virtually 100%. I mean, 98% or something like that. And that represents about 35 to 40% of the regulated folks who will be capped under this legislation. And those dollars will be reinvested through the Oregon Department of Transportation into transportation infrastructure improvements. So this is money that we never would have, provided almost entirely from out-of-state fuel providers to help our state's transportation infrastructure. And so trying to turn some of this conversation on its head, it's not just about what's it going to cost you, it's like what are we going to receive? And in rural Oregon, roads are a big deal. You know, healthy roads that can move goods and services long distances really matters. And so I think that's the other piece of this that we want to keep in mind. The other big chunk of dollars are going to go towards building infrastructure improvements. You know, the best kilowatt is the one never spent. It's better than clean energy. And energy efficiency, our built environment provides another 45% of all carbon out into the atmosphere. So every energy efficiency that we can generate, especially in low-income housing and communities that can least afford utilities to begin with, start to really help us on that back end. And so, and innovation and economic opportunity to create and innovate our way into a resilient economy is the other part. So that's the other half of a cap and invest policy, the invest part. So I just wanted to bring that point to bear as well.
Great. Other questions? Right over here.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from NIA. I'm curious if any of you can speak to how Oregon's renewable portfolio standards play in the market with a potential state carbon policy, and like what that interaction looks like, and as you're writing state carbon policy, like what the touch point is between those two things.
That's yours. I'll take all the softballs. Fine. Yeah, that's a good question, and there's been some good conversation around how do you ensure the voluntary market thrives, and what you're doing is additional, and how this comes to play. Where we see these policies fitting together really nicely is there is, as I said before, this is really not saying any one regulated entity, you have to achieve X outcome. It's saying you have to pay for your carbon now, and so you can choose, is it cheaper to switch to renewables, invest in energy efficiency, make that technological upgrade, drive down those emissions yourself, or to buy an allowance, or to buy an offset, or trade for one. And so I think there's certainly the renewables market stands to gain because there will be more demand for those products, and you can also carve out a little bit of, it gets very technical, but California and other places that have an RPS in place as well have been carving out some of the allowances to permit for when people buy big renewable purchases, they want to make sure they're truly additional and that they are doing something above and beyond what's required. And so there's a way to tailor the program without losing everyone else that addresses that concern. And I think, you know, what we've seen with Coal to Clean is while we're excited about it, it's ambitious, it's actually still not getting us all the way to where we'd like to be in the renewables field. It's our utilities that already invested in a lot of renewable energy credits and some programs, and it's been treated as, I'd say, a ceiling instead of a floor for where we need to go. And they've been told they don't need a lot of new build out or new purchases for the next 10 years because they had already done that. So how do we actually increase demand and increase the ability for those renewable projects to have that demand and be built. And that's where I think this can play in really nicely. The RPS helps achieve the utilities, some of what they need to achieve as a regulated entity, but it doesn't actually necessarily increase how much renewables we have in the shorter term.
Can I just add into, I think from a policy perspective, renewable portfolio standards are in some ways similar to these early incentives we see for electric vehicles, where you see essentially, you see a policy mechanism to help make up the shortfall of competitiveness in the early years because you're trying to drive a large-scale transformation. And then now, we have put so much effort on renewable energy. In many applications, wind and solar is competitive today. There are some analysts who say electric vehicles are at par with internal combustion engines. I think that would probably definitely be true in sort of the luxury car class. But there's also, Goldman Sachs, I think, says they will be competitive kind of across the board by 2020. And so these early policies are really critical for getting into the scale where we see large price reductions and allow for their penetration just purely based on an economic basis. Other questions? Wow. All right. You've answered them all. Well, I think what we're going to do now is we're going to take just about a 5-minute break before our next speaker when Commissioner Megan Decker is going to speak. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this panel.
Struggling to stay awake in that one.
of excitement for you. Yeah. If everyone could start returning their seats, we'll be getting started again in a moment. What? If everyone could return to your seats soon, we'll be starting momentarily. All right, so I know the brochure that says Lisa Hardy is going to be giving the next keynote, but due to a last-minute change, Megan Decker of the PUC will actually be giving the next keynote. She was appointed to the Oregon PUC by Governor Brown last year. She has managed utility commission advocacy in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, as counsel for Renewable Northwest. She also has past legal experience working as general counsel at the Port of Portland and doing land use law as a private practice attorney. She's also served as the board chair at Northwest Energy Coalition. She received her bachelor's from Stanford and her law degree from the University of Washington, where afterwards she served 2 years as a judicial clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. So welcome up Megan Decker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan Decker, and I'm a little surprised to be here today. If anyone here is like me and depends on a little bit of high-quality self-help reading to manage through the days and weeks, you'll know that gratitude is the answer to everything. So I'm going to start my remarks today with a couple of thank yous. And the first one is to Commission Chair Lisa Hardy. I am filling in for Chair Hardy today and going forward from the end of May as the Commission Chair. Chair Hardy made a difficult personal decision to step down from the Commission. I respect her decision, but will miss her a great deal, as will many others, with whom she has shared her trademark kindness, grace, wisdom, humor, and her deep dedication to the PUC's mission. I'm grateful to be in a position to be able to step up and support her and the state and the PUC's employees going forward. So my second thank you is to the Oregon legislature. And the PUC has had a great deal on its plate in recent years. In addition to the vital and increasingly challenging work of regulating utility rates, service quality, and safety, the PUC has been working to incorporate a number of new legislative energy policies and programs that don't always fit like a clean-cut puzzle piece into the existing system of regulation that we have. So my gratitude is that in 2017, the legislature gave us not a new policy or program, although we like those, I'm not saying we don't, but rather SB 978, which was a directive to step back and invite the public in with us to consider that existing system and the industry and policy changes confronting it from sort of a wide-angle perspective. I'm grateful for SB 978 and the public process that the Commission has created, because it's forced me, and I think many others, to step back and carefully consider where we are in order to more thoughtfully shape where we're going. SB 978, in turn, I think has begun to lead to conversations like this one that I thank the University of Oregon for hosting and all of you for participating in. I want to talk a little bit about the SB 978 conversations that I've observed. And one thing I want to say about them is that they have really reinforced the core values of the PUC, to which I, like Chair Hardy and Commissioner Bloom and the PUC's employees, are deeply committed. These conversations have really elevated again safety, reliability, and the value of electricity as an increasingly necessary universal service. We're seeing those values emerge again and again, and reinforcing those has, I think, given folks a chance to appreciate the ways in which our utilities have carried out their accountability to deliver on those values, and the ways in which we've been able to support them in doing so. I've also seen in the 978 process some important discussions of affordability and just and reasonable rates, which is a core value for the PUC. That concept has been sort of discussed and unpacked in terms of its elements of economic efficiency and fairness and equity and access to this service. And I just want to remind folks that the PUC's bread and butter is rate cases and carrying forward those rate-making principles that ideally incent economically efficient provision of a service that has to be made available to all, and whose costs should be fairly distributed according to principles of cost causation. Of course, in SB 978, other more transformative elements are under discussion and on the horizon. Chief among them being how, in a system where costs and services have largely been socialized for maximum efficiency, how to make space for individual and community choices about how electricity will be generated and served. Another discussion is sort of how to implement the policy level priorities that folks have for the entire system as a whole to incorporate cleaner and more distributed technologies and to enable innovation. A third thing that's come up a lot is how the state and the PUC as part of it wants to tackle equitable access to those essential services. The point I really want to leave with today is that those topics are being addressed at the Commission today, not just in the SB 978 discussions, but in day-to-day Commission dockets. Transformative changes are being considered and examined right now in conversation with the existing regulatory construct and the important values that I continue to hear people say they want it to deliver to society. So I'm going to go through a few examples of these. One is the Commission is engaged in proceedings discussing how utilities can most appropriately enable the state's transportation electrification goals, and how growth in transportation electrification can be managed as an asset rather than a strain to the electric system. So these discussions include a docket covering sort of principles for utility use of low carbon fuel standard credits, probably soon a rulemaking on the utility's long-term plans for transportation electrification. A second one I would note is, that I think Kristen brought up earlier today is, of course, the PUC's brand new role in designing and implementing a community solar program. And doing that requires us to balance a number of, I'm going to say, competing legislative directives. And, if we're successful in doing so, we'll really enable a new segment customers to participate in solar energy. Another thing that the PUC is doing every day is teasing out and really trying to understand analytically how to value the unique system benefits of things like distributed solar through our resource value of solar investigation, of storage, and we heard earlier today how complicated that is, but through the methodologies that are being examined to evaluate utility storage proposals in response to the storage mandate that the legislature provided a couple years ago. Also, looking at the ways that energy efficiency avoided costs are arrived at, which is a big part of how we wind up with the amount of energy efficiency we do. So I could go on, and I guess I will. We're examining how utilities will implement the increased renewable portfolio standard and the storage mandate as deliberately, thoughtfully, and efficiently as possible, so that we make that transformation as low cost and high value to customers as possible. And that includes looking at the role that the requirement for participation of small-scale, community-based renewable energy systems will play. So a final thing I guess I'll call out that we have underway is in various forums, we're looking at reviewing, getting better and better at understanding whether and how utilities are planning for and advancing so-called smart grid technology to make distribution systems a more effective system asset and a better host for those individual and community distributed energy choices I mentioned before. This is exciting and very difficult work. It doesn't get done without great people. And I mean the great people in this room, the stakeholders who join our proceedings and work hard to be respectful and well-informed contributors to what we're doing. And it takes great people working at the PUC. The PUC is facing the same generational transformations as the utilities we regulate. And we need to build a good, continually build a good sort of cadre of regulators for the future. So I'm taking this moment to exhort you to encourage the highly qualified economists, managers, engineers, policy wonks in your networks to look at the work that we do at the PUC and tell them that this is some of the most important, challenging, impactful, and rewarding work you can do. Because I mentioned earlier that gratitude is the answer for everything, I think I'm going to close now with a thank you for your respectful attention and a public appreciation for the PUC staff in the room, Jason Eisdorfer and Julie Peacock. I think that's who's here. You guys are the heart and soul of the PUC, and your care and dedication to the mission is invaluable, and we're very, very lucky to have you. So thank you, and thank all of you. I'm happy to take some questions. Henry. Remember, I'm surprised to be here, so make it an easy one. Okay?
Thank you, Megan. This is Henry Tillman, and I hope this is a softball question because it doesn't address anything at the PUC.
Oh, good.
But the topic of the day's title is the future of energy in Oregon, but large swaths of the electric system in Oregon aren't subject to PUC jurisdiction. My question is, in order to achieve an energy future in Oregon, do we have the tools we need to sort of bring all of Oregon to the same place, or do we need to do something different?
In my capacity as a PUC commissioner, I must remind you that we regulate investor-owned utilities that comprise something like 60 or 70% of the load in the state of Oregon. And I see some friends from the consumer-owned utility world out there, and I just frankly don't have an answer for you. But, you know, if they want to jump in. That wasn't a softball, by the way.
So this is actually a related question on a
Oh, man.
from a different angle.
Okay.
You have a lot of open dockets. They're all on very interesting and complex topics. Are there any, as you consider all those matters before you, is there any shortfall in authority that you think the PUC has to come to the best outcome on those dockets?
I'm not sure that I would characterize us as having a shortfall in authority. I think that one of the things that one might want to talk about, and that I have observed some people talking about in the SB 978 process, is the observation that we have a sort of operated for many, many years and decades with a traditional and fairly generic scope of responsibility to regulate to achieve, safe, reliable utility services at just and reasonable rates for the customers of investor-owned utilities in Oregon. And we also, if that's here, we've got a few other stars over here that over the years we've been asked to go out and tackle. So that, starts with the RPS, regulate to a specific outcome, and it continues to, sort of the storage mandates, the community solar programs, and various other really important and exciting work that the legislature has asked us to do. I think it's fair to say that you could step back and ask the question whether those things are fitting together perfectly with the way we've described that generic mission in the past. I don't. I wouldn't characterize there being a shortfall per se. There may be an interesting conversation. There may be ways that we need to unpack some of the concepts that have sustained us through all of these decades differently than we have before. But I guess I couldn't say that there's some obvious gap that we can't live without filling. I think that we have a really strong foundation to do good work from.
Hi there. You're very brave for stepping in so quickly.
Thank you.
My name is Jennifer, and I am with 350 PDX. And those of us in the community who are very excited about community solar are feeling like 2 years. We've been really patient, and I wonder if you can talk to how much longer it'll be before some of these projects will start to come online, and when we can expect to see them around here.
So what I can do is talk about two things, two areas of activity that are underway at the PUC. I'm not sure that I want to hazard a prediction about what that end date is. The two areas of work that are underway. One is getting a community solar administrator in place, and I know you have probably been hearing about that for months, and I honestly don't have the latest and greatest on where the request for proposals for people to come in and offer to be that administrator is. And so I'm looking next week. Yes, next week. So there, I promise there is movement and there is work happening on this every day, and I don't want to, throw other state agencies under the bus as having a lot of important requirements that we need to make sure are met before we, let out a RFP for what is a new thing and a very substantial role that an entity is going to play. The second thing that's going on is we have, and our staff has been responsive to concerns that our resource value of solar docket and the things that would have to follow from it to come up with a bill credit rate for the community solar program will take too long. Will sort of drag down the process. We have been presented with a staff proposal for something that could serve as an interim rate, and the commissioners will be taking that up in a public meeting on, I believe, April 24th. So this is is that right? Something like that, April 24th. So this is active. This is again program design implementation. Not something that fell within that original bucket of things that the PUC was going to do. Our staff has done a great job of putting something together that we hope will be successful and soon.
Well, congratulations first on your new position, even though it was handed very abruptly. I'm Susan Stratton from NIA. I was pleased to hear you talk about addressing energy efficiency avoided cost calculations. And I don't know if you can say much about that, but those of us that work on energy efficiency would really welcome that, as at least from my viewpoint at NIA, I see a lot of opportunities that we can't address because doing so would not meet certain cost effectiveness requirements, or they're below code, so we can't do them, therefore they stay as they are. Mm-hmm. So could you say anything about kind of what you're looking at and time frame and so forth?
I probably would have to ask our staff to provide any significant detail. What I do know is that the group of utilities and stakeholders and commission staff that are heavily engaged here have sort of bitten off a piece of that conversation, and I think have had really productive conversations about sort of streamlining some of the processes that we go through to arrive at the results and to make those kind of more transparent and predictable. That's what's come to me. I'm seeing an affirmative nod over there, and maybe there's something else. Anything else I should add? None at this time. Thank you.
Where was it? Oh, right there.
Debbie Driscoll, also with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. I was also heartened to hear that energy efficiency was one of the top priorities you listed, and excited about the community solar and renewable and storage priorities you mentioned. When thinking about the renewables and storage, one of the most effective ways to bring down the cost of those is to address energy efficiency first. And I wonder if there are opportunities you see for the Commission to encourage addressing efficiency opportunities when thinking about pursuing such projects.
I was carefully trained by a former boss of mine, Rachel Shimshak, to say energy efficiency is the first thing you look to every single time. It's the most cost effective, it's the best, it's the right thing. And that probably will never never leave my system at some level. I honestly have to answer that in sort of two ways. One is that I know that our staff is deeply committed to looking at some of those elements of the calculations that lead us to the amount of energy efficiency and the types of programs that we deliver. The other side of that I think you're kind of getting at is, is there a way to kind of streamline the messaging to customers who are considering options for their homes? That sounds like an interesting topic, and honestly, not one that I have a role at this point in saying more about. But maybe Wendy can say something about it.
Oh, there's a lot I'd like to say.
You're saving me?
I'm going to ask you a question. Wendy Gerlitz, Northwest Energy Coalition. I was just wondering if you could talk. The coalition has worked for a long time at the commission, and we've noticed lately that there's a lot of new groups coming in and participating in the processes, environmental justice, some underserved ratepayer groups, and I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about how the commission views those new groups coming in, and what you see in terms of the commission being able to bring more of that equity lens into its work.
We've been looking very carefully and purposefully at how to meaningfully engage folks who want to be part of what we do. It's an important value for me personally, and it's something that kind of came up right away. Has been part of what the commission has done, but came up right away as part of this SB 978 investigation. We've been taking steps forward. Julie Peacock has been working with some different groups to just have that conversation about, yes, like we have a number of like highly complex dockets and investigations that all of you who are sort of professional stakeholders and do this all day, every day, are the most obvious candidates for. But we need other types of input, and we want to bring in other voices to inform what we're doing. I think that there are some conversations underway that staff has been involved in around thinking about funding sources for helping new groups participate, or opportunities that we can help connect folks to for education. Education has been a big value that we've been trying to bring into the SB 978 process to really, again, bring out those first principles of what we're doing and why, to begin to create the language to sort of level the playing field of understanding, to begin to be able to approach what are, frankly, at the end of the day, sort of complex conversations that I can get a little lost in. So in terms of the equity lens, I think that's really a conversation for the 978 process. I mean, there is a fundamental sort of equity value in the concept of regulated universal service, and that's something that I think people have had a chance to sort of step back and realize works pretty well about our current system, and there are things that we can do probably to make that better. That's probably a conversation we need to have as a state as a whole, rather than solely a PUC conversation.
So much, Commissioner Decker. And we will go ahead and take about a 15-minute break and reconvene at 2:45.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, no. It's. I did nothing to earn the honor, other than just continue to be in the right place at the right time. So it's certainly a challenge that I'll have to step up to, and one that I'm looking forward to
one-man show. At this point, we'll ask if everyone can please take their seats. All right, we are on to our third panel. It is the last panel of the day, and it is the PUC process, and I'll hand it over to Adam Schultz to introduce the speakers.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. So we have the privilege here of having the final panel of the day to talk in depth about a PUC docket, or not a docket, but proceeding. So I know that's a fortunate position to be in at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Luckily, I don't think it's sunny outside, so that's good news. So I'm going to just start with a brief introduction of kind of what we're talking about here. I mean, you got a little bit of an overview from Commissioner Decker. I think you're going to have a lot more in-depth conversation of some of the hot button issues she touched on there in terms of what's kind of being discussed at these SB 978 workshops. But first, I thought I would just do ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I give a little bit of a high-level overview of kind of what's prompted SB 978, and ask Julie Peacock from the PUC to kind of give an overview of that process before we get into some of the questions. So I'll just go down the line here to my left.
I was going to say, I'll just go Wendy.
You're going to be Wendy, or you're just
no,
going to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Wendy Gerlitz. No, I'm actually Julie Peacock. I'm from the Oregon Public Utility Commission. I'm the policy advisor there, and I'm the staff lead for the SB 978 process.
I'm a staff attorney at the Oregon Citizens Utility Board, and for those that are unfamiliar with CUB, we're the residential ratepayer advocate for the investor-owned utilities here in the state of Oregon. We were established in 1984 by a ballot initiative, and have a statutory right to intervene at proceedings at the Public Utility Commission and the legislature as a matter of right. So pretty familiar with a lot of the folks on the panel here today.
Okay, I'm Wendy Gerlitz. I work for Northwest Energy Coalition. We are a nonprofit organization, membership organization that works across the Pacific Northwest to promote clean energy. We have a very diverse membership that includes utilities, nonprofit environmental organizations, ratepayer advocates. In fact, both of these guys are members of ours, and a lot of people in the room. So trying to bring together all the voices to promote clean energy across the region. And we do a lot of work at the Public Utility Commission and the commissions across the 4-state region.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Franco Albi with Portland General Electric. We are the largest electric utility provider in the state. I'm going to one-up Mike. We were established in 1889, and I can do that because Julie could one-up us when they were established, but she already went. So I'm responsible for integrated resource planning and part of a team called Strategy Integration and Planning at PGE.
And I forgot to introduce myself. Adam Schultz. I'm with the Oregon Department of Energy. So you heard from Director Benner earlier. And I guess in that ranking, I guess we're not as old as PGE, but we're older than CUB. So I guess we're third in the list here, probably. I think 1974, if I have my statistics right. But to get us started, I wanted to give a kind of rewind to the morning kind of keynote from Director Benner, giving an overview of kind of an energy system in transition. Because I think that's really what's prompted this SB 978 process, which we'll be talking about here for the next hour. It's just kind of in the 20th century, I think it's all kind of familiar to folks, but kind of the electric sector was, pretty much operated in the same way. You had utilities with one-way power flows to customers, power plants were getting bigger, rates were getting cheaper. That kind of is pretty much the story through the 20th century. Things have started to change the last couple of decades. Started really with accelerated with deregulation in the 90s, starting to open up new options for customer choice. certainly rapid advancements in technology, increasing policy drivers on renewables and carbon have been coming to the fore. These kind of pressures are really starting to change the equation. A lot more distributed energy out there, so you have this kind of tension between centralized and decentralized resources. Cheaper energy with renewables and natural gas, and that's kind of started to raise a lot of questions around the structure of the utility sector and the role of regulation and the role of utilities. And I think that's really what's prompted SB 978. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Julie to kind of give a bit of an overview of SB 978, kind of what it says, what it's meant to do, and the public process that you all are now leading.
Great, thanks, Adam. So SB 978, I feel like you guys have heard those three numbers quite a bit today, but it's actually a rather short bill, and the very, very high level summary. It actually just requires the commission to hold a public process and asks us to investigate whether policy trends, drivers, and technologies are impacting the way that utilities are traditionally regulated. So in order to implement the bill, the commission has launched a very fun public process. Okay, no one's going to deny how fun it's been. It's been an unusual process at the commission, so I'll talk about that a little bit. But the way we actually started our SB 978 process was going out and talking to our stakeholders. We did pretty extensive stakeholder interviews where we just sat one-on-one with our stakeholders and asked them, given this bill and given the requirements, what are the things that are most important to you to see out of the process? And so we took those answers from our stakeholder community and designed a 7th or 8th month long process whereby we'll hopefully get to the answers that the bill asks us to get to, hopefully through a lot of consensus. But we do realize that there may be elements of the process that don't lead to total consensus. And so the process is divided into 3 phases. The first phase was a time where stakeholders could get together and talk about the existing system. Now, you probably think, oh, how interesting could the existing system be? But it's rather fascinating to hear your colleague who you've worked with for 10 years talk about the existing system from their perspective. I think that was really informative to hear how people would describe not just how regulation works, but how they operationalize regulation from their perspective, from their organizations. So we've just ended phase 1, and then on April 24th, we'll kick off phase 2, which is investigating the trends and the policy drivers. We're going to start with a technology forum. And then the third phase is, okay, given all of these amazing things that we've just learned about technology, how policy is changing, how rapidly deployed things can be integrated into the regulated utility system, what does that mean? Does that mean these things present challenges and opportunities that we should implement changes around? Or does that mean that everything is working pretty okay? There may be some small things that we need to change around the edges. And then we're going to take all of that wonderful input we're going to get from our stakeholders and roll that into a report that's due to the legislature on September 15th of this year. So that's just a very general overview of the process.
Great. Thanks, Julie. So with that, we have a few questions here that I wanted to go through with the panelists, and I kind of want to give them, because this is kind of a dynamic, ongoing process. First, we'll start at the end with Franco and go in reverse order here. What are some of the major challenges and opportunities that you see from PGE's perspective that kind of make this process necessary at this time? What are those drivers? And actually, I'll wrap in the next part of it, which is, just play right onto that in terms of what kind of outcomes would you see as an ideal outcome from PGE's perspective?
Sure. I think you guys did a great job of kind of framing up how the industry has evolved over time and some of the rapid changes in technology and advancements that are happening. SB 978 process is a fun process.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Franco.
They had candy at the first meeting, so you can't really beat that. But one of the questions they asked initially, too, that was really good was, of the existing system and the policy objectives and safe, reliable, and affordable, what else needs to be added on? And I think that this SB 978 process gives an opportunity for two main things. One is to ask those questions, and two, which has been alluded to a couple times here, bringing other stakeholders into the conversation. So we've had various equity groups, social groups that have not necessarily participated before but are very interested and would like to have a voice at the table. It's a great opportunity to have that voice because as utilities we can learn from that as well. And it gives us an opportunity to have shared learning about how the system works and how we can be more thoughtful as we transition or transform the system to a clean energy future and include everybody along that path. So while we have this SB 978 process, it's kind of a vehicle that allows for broader discussion of things that were happening anyway. As Commissioner Decker said, there are a lot of dockets that are open right now. One of the values of a regulated system is the incrementalism that happens. It's a continuous evolution process. So even absent 978, we would be looking at how we would transform to this new future because it's what the customers are asking for. They're telling us they want cleaner. They're telling us that they want different technology options to be serviceable. They want it easy. So that's where we see our role in this future is to make those connections easy, make them seamless, have customers use energy the way they want to. I'll absolutely echo the comments earlier about energy efficiency and that being the best kilowatt is the kilowatt saved. And I think we need to expand our view of energy efficiency beyond kind of energy efficiency programs and think about energy efficiency and efficiency of technologies. Was having a discussion the other day about light rail. And it's great that it's electric. Is it efficient? I didn't know the answer. I don't know how efficient the max light rail is. So there's a lot of things that we can do beyond what we've done traditionally that takes these additional stakeholders to bring those questions out. So those are some of the major challenges and opportunities, and I'll stop there and save my ideal outcomes till after I hear what other people think.
All right. Well, I just want to, before we get to Mike down the line, I wanted to I just asked a follow-up question, which is about these new stakeholders in the process. I was just curious if you have any main takeaways from your perspective, something that you've learned from them, or an idea or something they brought to the table that maybe you weren't thinking about before. That. Absolutely, yeah. So one of the reasons that SB 978 process is fun is because the PUC has brought in RMI and RAP to help facilitate, and they really brought some different approaches to conversations. So one of the first meetings basically used the room as a continuum and asked a bunch of questions and said, do you think the system today provides what it was intended to do, safe, reliable, affordable power? Folks lined up on a spectrum, yes on one side, no on the other, and everywhere in between. And as you can imagine, there were people throughout that continuum. Most of the utility folks were on the, yeah, it sure does. Some of the environmental groups and social justice groups were kind of more towards the no side. But when we peeled that back and asked why, it was because the utility view was around, if everybody goes and turns on their lights, nobody's scared that they're going to get shocked. They're not afraid that when they're walking down the street, something's going to fall on their head and they're going to get electrocuted. From the environmental group's perspective, they were thinking about climate change. They were thinking about carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And so from their perspective, saying, well, that's not safe in that regard. So being able to learn how people are interpreting the questions and trying to find that common understanding has been really eye-opening in these conversations. Your turn, Mike.
Thanks. I'll say to Cub, a major opportunity for this process has been to kind of take a step back and examine the current regulatory, technology, and policy drivers that exist within the confines of the utility regulatory system today, and then think creatively within that context on ways to incent utilities to behave in certain ways to get to this clean, efficient, flexible system of the future where I think that there's general broad stakeholder consensus where that's where it's headed. And regarding why this process is necessary, I think at CUB, there's a variety of interrelated and converging factors. Like I mentioned, some of these technology and policy drivers, but also new technology and policy is driven largely by new innovations in climate policy and the need to meet the confines of the state's greenhouse gas emissions and carbon reduction goals. So within that context, we think that this process can be useful to examine some of those regulatory and technology and policy drivers to meet those goals and further that cause. So taking a step back and kind of looking at where we are right now, in the current state of affairs, the regulatory apparatus incents investor-owned utilities to invest large amounts of capital in generally large generating plant and transmission projects to put into their rate base so they can get a rate of return for shareholders. But we're kind of seeing a different a change in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest and throughout the rest of the country in that baseload generation is no longer needed in the way that it used to be. We're seeing loads are largely flat or decreasing, and existing policies and incentives in Oregon, like the expanding RPS mandate, are bringing on more and more intermittent generation onto the grid. And so if you look at loads flat or decreasing, and also new intermittent resources being brought onto the grid, it seems that the future flexibility is going to be a big concern for how the utility can meet their needs and balance their system. And at the same time, there's different existing policies and technologies that the utilities are looking into. We're seeing increased participation in regional energy imbalance markets, so the utilities can dispatch their system in sub-hourly intervals. We're looking at different various applications of energy storage, and electric vehicles are coming on more and more. There's different distributed generation and demand-side resources being brought on more and more rapidly. And all of this taken into context is to say that a threshold question and a challenge of the SB 978 process is whether these traditional regulatory structures that incent large capital investment are traditionally suited towards transitioning into this flexible utility of the future. If not, do different regulatory models warrant being examined, such as incentive-based regulation or performance-based regulation? And so one thing that we've been thinking about internally at CUB is instead of incentivizing the utilities on one metric, the capital investment, to increase their rate base, perhaps thinking creatively about different ways to get the utility to meet its revenue requirement, while not only just meeting some of that through capital investment, but also through meeting different metrics such as greenhouse gas reduction or decarbonization goals, rate stability metrics, reliability. And so other states are exploring this as well. I should say that in Oregon, we're not kind of going out on this alone. I believe 33 or so states are at least looking at some sort of grid modernization initiative. In New York, they're years ahead of us as far as looking at incentive-based regulatory structures. So we do have different models to lean on and learn from as we continue through this process. And so incentive-based regulation is kind of just one that we might want to look at. But I'd be remiss if, in my role as the consumer advocate here, that when we're thinking about incentive-based regulation, we shouldn't just think about incentives for the utilities, but should also think about carrots and sticks. Penalties for not hitting certain metrics that I mentioned earlier. Also, incentivizing them to hit others, just to making sure that there's different creative ways that we can look at getting to that revenue requirement, and creating flexibility in the system, and being able to advance these technologies and policies that are already being rolled out.
I was going to say, Julie, you're next, but I just want to, in prepping for this panel, I gave Julie the pass that I won't take it personally if she wants to skip any of these questions being on PUC staff. I know some of these questions might be tricky in some cases, so.
Don't worry, my boss is not here. Oh, wait.
We'll have him step out of the room.
No, I mean, this is sort of an interesting question to answer just from my perspective, challenges and opportunities, because there is a challenge that presents an opportunity to us with our stakeholder community, and that is sort of creating a unified dialogue. I think that there have been a lot of dockets that we've mentioned and a lot of dockets that have been difficult to get through and divisive in our stakeholder community. And one thing, I think I said this at our first SB 978 meeting, is that taking a step back with 978, that's a way that we've been thinking about it at the commission, to have this time to have a conversation about, hey, what is it that you think that we should be doing here? And to allow stakeholders to have that conversation with one another is actually extremely valuable to furthering like the community dynamic that we have at the commission. So while that is challenging, making sure everyone is sort of speaking the same language, creating the same vocabulary, it is time intensive. I think that is a challenge that really, in the long run, will be really beneficial. Just giving everyone an opportunity to say, this is what we feel like we're doing here at the Commission, and then take that forward into the next phase. Something I didn't say before about how we're proceeding through the SB 978 process is that after the report to the legislature, which we have been sort of calling a roadmap, there will be other dockets that open up and are specific to sort of the issues that are entailed in the 978 report. So there's another level of further investigation after this, and I think that the work that we're doing during this part of the process will be extremely valuable for that.
Okay. So I think, the 978 process is coming at a really interesting time where you have a convergence of a number of different factors. I mean, you have the equity groups that Franco mentioned, that more stakeholders are coming forward and wanting to have a voice in energy more than any other time in the past. You also have the technology changes and the new, people can put solar on their roof, and batteries are coming, and you have technology changes that are really changing the nature of the utility system. And so the convergence of these different factors, I think it's a really interesting time to be having the conversation and reflecting on our regulated system, how is it working? And I want to give kudos to the PUC, because I think this process, first of all, I think it has been an opportunity, but it's only been a positive opportunity because of the way that they have orchestrated the process. That's been very well done, very accessible. It hasn't looked like any other PUC process that I have ever participated in, and I think in this instance that is a very good thing. It's been a very accessible process, I think, and there are a number of new groups that are participating and that I feel like have been given the space and the education resources and to participate. So I think the first opportunity is just that the PUC can do something different, and it can be successful, and it can bring in these other voices, which I think is really important. That said, I'll say Northwest Energy Coalition came into this process wanting to look at a couple of different things and whether we could make some improvements. The Public Utility Commission is an economic regulator. And so over time, advocacy groups have become very good at translating environmental values into economic terms. And we've been very good so far, I think, at translating low income and affordability concerns into the economic realm to kind of force the Commission and the utilities to appreciate environmental values and low-income values, and I think we've done a fairly decent job of that, but it's definitely been frustrating, and it's been a lot of work. And so I think now we look at the system and we say, is there an opportunity to look beyond what we've already been able to accomplish and further those environmental goals and those goals of serving underserved customers, the ones that we're not really reaching. Environmental values and sort of those underserved values are both very hard to quantify in our current economic construct. And so I think the coalition has been asking the question, do we need to look beyond that pure economic regulator role and going towards some of the more performance-based type things that Mike was mentioning, to include other values in the performance of the utilities and judging the performance of the utilities, so that we can really start to get at some of those values beyond just the pure dollars and cents. And I think it's a tough thing for the coalition, because we have learned to play in the economic regulatory setting, and it is a big driver of affordability, which is very important to the coalition. So there is some risk in terms of opening the door and saying, well, we want to include environmental values, and we want to include more consideration of how we serve low-income customers. There's some risk in saying that we should look beyond the dollars and cents, because we also don't want to blow up a construct that's been very successful in terms of keeping all customer rates low and forcing the system to be very efficient from an economic standpoint. And so what we're looking for, I think, is that conversation that can lead to that nexus of what are some things that we can do that keep the best of the current system, but also make more tangible gains, specifically in the area of considering the environment and considering underserved customers. And I think it'll take a little while. The process has been fairly slow to date. I think that's by necessity because we're bringing in new folks. We need to all get on the same page. But I think we'll get there. So we'll see.
Franco?
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that, I really enjoy being on panels with Wendy because we find that we agree on a lot of stuff.
I was actually complaining about that yesterday to some of you. I was like, you got to give them something to the audience needs some.
We'll find something to argue.
Oh, that's tougher questions.
This won't be it. One of the terms that we never want to see anywhere in the industry is blow up. So whether it's anything on the system or the regulatory system itself, we don't want to see that blown up. There's a lot of good things that come out of the system that we have, and I mentioned before incrementalism, but really like a continuum of evolution. So if we start to explore other alternatives, performance-based rate making, multi-year rate plans, these things, it doesn't have to be a switch. It doesn't have to be current system, gone, new system, let's see what happens. In fact, that as a one-state utility in a wonderfully progressive state, we don't have as much capacity for mistakes as maybe some multi-state utilities or very large entities, thinking Texas or back east. So it's really important that we think through these processes thoughtfully, and we're excited to quote-unquote experiment on some of it, but do so in a way that doesn't take us too far to an edge that we could fall off.
It's interesting along those lines. So the regulatory assistance project, you'll hear from Jess Shipley here after our panel, but just a comment from one of their principals who was attending the last workshop that I thought was interesting for our context here was he made the comment kind of at the end of the day, having observed us in these group discussions, talking about these kind of issues, and he noted that what's unusual about the situation here in Oregon, from having been involved in these in other states, is the lack of crisis, that there is not a need to blow up the system. At least that wasn't the sense of the room that he had, that it's really about trying to get ahead of some of these changes and thinking about how we could do things better, but that it's not broken, which I thought was an interesting observation from someone from outside the state, kind of who's been through these kind of processes in other places. But with that said, I was going to move on to some other questions here and dive into some more of the details. So I thought I'd jump into the question that's been kind of percolating throughout the day here, which is around equity. And I know that Commissioner Decker just spoke, and I think several times mentioned that the current system really is designed around providing universal, non-discriminatory access to electricity, and I think that's kind of how it's been structured. But some of the stakeholders, particularly some of the newer ones in this SB 978 process, have, I think, kind of taken issue with that in terms of the adequacy of that approach delivering equitable results. So, one example, just kind of in terms of economic equity, would be, if you have two different ratepayers live in the same area, same utility, one makes $200,000 a year, one makes $40,000 a year, yet their rate that they pay is going to be the same. And probably exacerbating those issues, the lower income customer is more likely to have a lower efficiency home. So those are kind of, that's just an example of the kind of type of some of the kind of equity issues that are being brought to the attention of these workshops. So I was just curious to hear from the panelists, and we'll mix up the order. We'll start with Mike here. What your perspective is on these kind of equity issues, economic or otherwise, and to what extent do you think it's appropriate for the PUC to kind of look at that definition around universal non-discriminatory access and kind of maybe look at other lenses or definitions of how they can address some of these equity issues?
Thanks, Adam. I think it is appropriate, and one thing that I can say that I've taken away from the SB 978 process thus far is that equity can be a subjective concept, and it means different things to different people, and it means different things to different organizations that represent different constituents or groups or trade associations. So people come to the table with different ideas of what equity is, and trying to transform a system or trying to move a regulatory system towards something that's equitable and just for all, there's a lot of struggle to build consensus within that, but I will commend the PUC and the process that's gone on thus far to take into consideration a multitude of different stakeholder perspectives and hear them and move forward. I'll talk just a little bit about a couple of components of equity from CUB's perspective. We believe that this transition that I was talking about to this flexible, efficient, clean, modernized grid of the future in an equitable manner that's kind of equal to all residential ratepayers is really paramount. I mean, even today we see there's too many non-voluntary shutoffs and customers struggling to meet their energy needs. And we'd like to see the utilities capture some of the benefits of the technologies and policies that I mentioned earlier and have been discussed throughout the day in order to gain efficiencies, work in some of these regional markets, and maximize revenues through off-system sales to create downward pressures on rates that can benefit all. At the same time, electric vehicles can be brought on in a manner that creates load and spreads the fixed cost of the distribution system more thinly, which can also create downward pressure on rates. So I think there's different ways to bring on new technologies and policies that can lower the energy burden across the board. The fact is, though, like Adam mentioned, that not all residential ratepayers are alike. Oregon's a very diverse state from both a socioeconomic and a climate perspective. Particularly in the eastern part of the state, many homes are poorly weatherized and are manufactured and are subject to more extreme temperature fluctuations. The energy burden associated with heating and cooling these largely manufactured homes in comparison to the average household income is relatively great. And it's also important to keep in mind that Oregon's different than a lot of other states, and that we're a winter peaking state that is driven mostly by electric heating load. We've seen studies come out in different states such as California and Texas, where they're summer peaking loads that are driven mostly by air conditioning, and they can roll out pricing programs that penalize on-peak usage that don't disadvantage low-income communities because those households actually use less power. However, in Oregon, since there's a significant amount of electric heat load, a lot of these lower socioeconomic folks in the eastern part of the state actually use more energy than many of the more affluent folks in the western part of the state. And so to the extent that the SB 978 process is going to move forward and look at different pricing programs to discourage on-peak power usage, we think it's definitely important to design those programs carefully and not to penalize these low-income consumers that have to use energy on peak in order just to meet their basic energy subsistence needs. There's been talk about considering a percentage of income payment program that the PUC has looked into, and I think generally that's a concept that CUB is also amenable to looking at. There's been some difficulties as far as funding and governance issues associated with it, but if there are ways that we can cap what a given household is paying for its energy needs in the percentage of its overall income, that could be a good outcome of this process or a different docket process. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that issue right there, because it gets into another complicated issue that we might get a chance to address later in the panel, which has to do with the overall energy bill, right? So which is I think it complicates this, that it's not just electric, but those customers also probably have, in some cases, gas bills also, and then gasoline for their cars. So it kind of just curious if you have any thoughts about that. It's kind of complicates it having it not just be their electric, kind of the overall energy bill concept.
Yeah, so kind of speaking in terms of increasing electrification in the future and how maybe higher rates may be driven by a more electrified process, but those could be offset by other bills. I mean, I do think that can be the case as the system continues to become increasingly electrified, and to the extent that can help Oregon achieve its decarbonization and greenhouse gas goals, which I think there's relatively broad consensus that if we are going to decarbonize the system, increasing the electrification mix and then cleaning it up are kind of two of the main steps to get there. But to CUB and to some of the things that we think about internally, it's not necessarily about whether or not those rates are going up because of an increased amount of electricity on the system. It's whether or not the utilities are making the right investments that are producing some of those benefits that I alluded to earlier that can create downward pressure on rates, that are helping integrate renewables in flexible ways, that are looking towards this future where there's going to be this decreased need in baseload generation. And so to us, even if rates are going up, in some instances, there's benefits that can be achieved throughout the system that can offset those.
Wendy, curious your thoughts on these equity concerns.
Yeah, so I think this is a piece that's really important to the Northwest Energy Coalition. In fact, we brought on a staff person about a year ago, Oriana Manera. I'm sure many of you know her, basically to try to make more connections to the new communities that are coming into this space, the underserved customers and environmental justice community that hasn't really played in the energy space but is starting to be interested in. So I think this is a really critical value to the coalition to bring these voices in. We, for a long time, have represented sort of low-income voices and had a lot of low-income advocates in the coalition, but have really felt like there were voices missing because that constituency, even in and of itself, is very diverse. And so one low-income household doesn't look the same as another low-income household. And I think the more that we can learn from the actual people that are experiencing, the energy, the energy problems, problems with billing, the better we can make our programs. And so I think it's about trying to find the right way to incorporate those voices and bring in a diversity of organizations that can actually better represent directly the customers on the ground. I also think it's increasingly important because of the technology changes that were mentioned earlier and some of the trends that are happening in the electric industry with trying to promote people to charge their cars or use their energy at a certain point. I mean, I'm a participant in PGE's Flex program. I don't know how many of you are doing that, but use the energy when it's abundant on the system and don't use it when everybody else wants to use it, and that reduces costs for everybody. And so to the extent that we can make customers more aware of what's going on in the energy system so that they can make informed choices, the better off we're all going to be. So, I don't think we expect every single customer to care or have a voice, but at least to get representatives from those different groups is really important. And especially in a process like 978, where you're talking about what improvements do we need to make, those voices are really critical because we need to understand exactly how people are experiencing the system and what they're willing to do in order to know what type of improvements to make. So I guess, and to your question about, I do want to say that we've been increasingly at the coalition starting to talk about energy burden rather than just electric utility burden, because I do think that there are a lot of synergies between our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, our efforts to serve a more, make sure that underserved customers are getting the right service, and the decarbonization of the grid. What we envision is that more of our things out there that we're using will be moving to electric, and that the burden on the electric utilities to serve that load will get higher. And so if you're increasing your electric use, your electric bill might be increasing. So if you're only looking at that one element, you might say, oh my gosh, these customers are having to pay so much more. But if you look at it in terms of energy burden, what you'll hopefully see is that their natural gas usage goes down, their gasoline purchases and their vehicle maintenance goes down, and overall we're improving the livability of that household by looking at energy burden. So I think we need to start talking about energy burden and doing it in a way that I'm not suggesting that the electric utility pay for and subsidize all of that, but I think it needs to be part of the consideration of how we're looking at managing the system.
Right, and I wanted to turn to Franco next to get your PG's perspective on these equity issues. And I also want to give kudos to Franco. In prepping for this panel, we talked about some of these issues, and I give credit to Franco that he thought this should be moved up in the list, equity. So he wanted to make sure that it didn't fall off the list at the end. So I give him credit for that. And with that, I wanted to get your perspectives.
Thanks, and I can't take credit for it. I was at a separate conference where there was discussion about transportation electrification, which areas of this company's service territory were going to be electrified first. And the person from the utility that was talking about it talked all about the financial analysis that they had done and all of the various studies that they had done. And he got asked a question about, well, did you look at the socioeconomic conditions of the people where you're talking about electrifying? And he was dumbfounded. He didn't have an answer to that question. And so it really resonated with me. Like, we can't have the equity conversation as an afterthought. It has to be upfront. So it's one of the learnings from these conversations that we have when we have these groups at the table. So I definitely can't take credit for it. But the concerns around it are foundational. And as we transform to this clean energy future, they really have to be at the forefront. We talk about it as layering on to the values of the system of safe, reliable, affordable, layering on clean and equitable in those conversations. There were so many things that were said. I had to take a couple of notes. So I'm going to maybe bunny trail around. But I was encouraged to hear about expanding to economy-wide energy burden. We like to call it the total energy wallet, trying to find something that is catchy for people to remember. But it is really beyond what your electric bill is. It's looking at all of the costs associated with the energy that you use and how you can make that most efficient. As those end uses get more electrified, there's two components to the rate. One is the amount of energy that you use, and the other is the amount of infrastructure that's required to facilitate that use. And so we have to look at it not just from a dollars per kilowatt hour sales approach, but also from the infrastructure investments that are being made that are foundational to get to the future that Mike is talking about, which is a flexible future, and that requires participation from both sides. And what I mean by that is the producer side, people that are making energy and electricity, and the consumer side, those who are using it. We just completed a deep decarbonization study for PG service territory, where we looked at various pathways to decarbonize our energy supply by 80%, reduce emissions across the economy-wide energy burden by 80%. The good news is it's possible. We have the technologies today to do that. The question of how you get there and how much it costs are the ones that we got to work together with the stakeholders to identify. But each of them requires the conversation with folks around equity and all the other pieces that we've been talking about. So the other piece that I jotted a note on for the low-income customers, that's another value of the regulated system, when you have the ability to do some socialization of those costs to make sure that you aren't disadvantaging one customer group over another, because while there's a kind of postage stamp rate, or could be, that percentage of the dollars that people spend as a proportion of their income is significantly different when you're on the low income side of the scale versus the more affluent side of the scale. So, a 2% increase for somebody that's on the higher end of the earnings stage is probably less less impactful change than a 2% increase on somebody that's on the lower economic scale. So.
And Julie, from the PUC's perspective, curious your thoughts on kind of this, universal access versus these other broader equity concerns.
I think I would just go back to something that Mike started with, and that is equity is defined differently by many people who have engaged in our process. Franco was talking about the sort of spectrum exercise that we had, and one of the questions that really stood out for me from that exercise was about equity. If the regulated utility system was equitable, and you had somebody on the side that said yes, and it was someone from a utility, and they said yes, absolutely, universal service. You can get service regardless of anything about you personally. That is something that is amazing about the electric system, is that as an individual you can receive service. I think something that's really emerged that I've found really interesting, and I've heard some themes of that today, and also in the 978 process, is this very interesting reliance that we all have on electricity. Someone referenced, just losing power, like how, I don't want to say traumatic, but if the power went out in this building right now, we would all be shocked, right? Like that would be really shocking to all of us.
I'd ask Franco some questions.
I'd sneak out in the darkness.
But traditionally, the utilities have focused on reliability, and that has been where our focus has been, and with the equity lens, it's been on providing universal service. And I think some of the conversations that have happened at the commission, not that they've been incredibly enlightening, but enlightening in the sense of we ask a lot of the electric system, and we will continue to ask a lot of the electric system. We will ask it to examine itself in different ways and think about how it provides service in different ways. And I think that the 978 process has been an excellent forum for us to have that conversation. One of the things that we have done at the commission has been to convene a smaller subset of stakeholders who we may not traditionally think of as commission stakeholders, to start having that conversation around what are the things that you are interested in? How can we help you engage in the commission process? One of the things that we learned from our stakeholders when we first went out to do our interviews was that education was very important. Not just us educating, but the opportunity to educate the commission, and so and our stakeholders in the issues that new stakeholder groups see. So we've tried to provide opportunities for stakeholders to provide that education firsthand. And I think at our last meeting we had an equity and social justice group that gave a presentation, and I think that was really quite educational and enlightening for a lot of our stakeholders in the room and the commission itself.
Now, I want to change gears a bit and switch to a different topic, customer choice. I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. It's I think when I think about it, I really started thinking about it kind of started around deregulation in the 1990s, and states kind of looked at a variety of different options and how to expand options for customers. So you have on one extreme states like Texas that have, you essentially can get a menu and choose your energy from any one of dozens of providers. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it's that many, 40, Franco says. And so on the flip side of that, we have vertically integrated utilities like we have here, where for residential customers at least, PG is our option here in Portland, where I am at least. We do have other options built around that. So we have direct access for commercial industrial customers. We have as residential customers portfolio options that allow us, like I do, to select 100% renewable options. There's other opportunities for choice around net energy metering for rooftop solar customers, community renewables, which we've heard about a bit today, and then in the industry, the newest customer choice vehicle that's out there and getting a lot of headlines is something called community choice aggregation. It's really taken on a life of its own in California, and this is where entire cities or counties, this is enabled by statute there in several other states, can leave, not leave the service territory of the utility, but en masse choose to get their electricity through the utility, but source it from someone other than the utility, often from renewable projects is what they're doing in California. So anyway, that's kind of the wide range. There are all these options out there, and certainly these questions are coming up in SB 978, and just curious to get the panelists' take, particularly in light of the city of Portland and Multnomah County, as probably many in the room are aware, adopted ordinances last spring looking at 100% renewable electricity by 2035 and 100% renewables across all energy uses by 2050. So with all that as context, curious to get, it's a bit of a loaded question, but curious to get the panelists' perspective on what customer choice means to them. Where do they see the pressures around customer choice, and to what extent do they think that's a kind of ripe discussion for SB 978 and for the state moving forward? And I'll start with Wendy.
There's a lot to say around this topic, and there's a lot of different varieties of customer choice. So you mentioned a few. I mean, there's also, in Washington, a number of the utilities have green tariffs that allow their large customers to pick renewable power but stay with the utility service territory that they're on. So I think there's a lot of different ways to construct customer choice. So I will say, as a general notion, the coalition is very behind the idea that customers should choose. However, there's something to be said for customers having a voice in that choice with with the utility that's serving them. The more customers, for example, that are calling for green energy, that are doing it with their utility, within the utility service territory, the more we green the system for everybody, the more that we allow customers to go out that have the means to select a different provider that's maybe green, the less pressure, frankly, that's on the utility that's left serving everybody who doesn't have the means or who doesn't have the interest. And so we are concerned about that dynamic, that if you start peeling off customers with the means, one, what do you do? What is left? And how much pressure is left on the existing system to green itself? And then the second concern, frankly, is a concern about how well does community choice, and especially that system that I just talked about where customers can go and choose their provider, what does that do to underserved customers who don't have the time or the means, to look into what provider they want to choose? Or, there are reports actually right now coming in from several different areas of the country that have systems like that really indicate that customers aren't getting a very good deal, that they're paying a lot. There have been actually cases where the states are bringing cases against companies for charging the customers way too much money. And so I think you have to be really careful of unintended consequences. Community choice sounds great. Like, yeah, I want to choose who provides my energy and what, but the regulated system that we have offers a lot of advantages, both from an environmental standpoint and from a low income and affordability standpoint. And so I think we really want to be conscious of unintended consequences in those areas as we move to consider things like community choice. So we're good with the notion of community choice, but how that gets implemented, I think, is going to be critically important. I guess I will say too that I think there's a lot of really good things about the way that the system in Oregon is set up that can be perfected, but the notion that we need to kind of throw out this entire system and go to an unregulated market or something like that, we're pretty skeptical about that. We think the current system offers a lot of benefits that we would think could be jeopardized by doing that.
I'm going to jump down the mic next. I'm curious, particularly, we'll come back to Julie if she wants to make comments. But I wanted to build off something that Wendy said in terms of it's interesting hearing that you said some studies from around the country showing kind of that customers are actually getting a bad deal in some of these cases. So I'm just curious, being the ratepayer advocate, curious your thoughts generally about this topic, but if you could touch on that in particular, kind of if you have any thoughts about as you look at kind of different options and expanding customer choice, kind of its the challenges it presents for you as a ratepayer advocate in looking out for the ratepayers.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of dovetail off some of the comments that Wendy was making regarding community choice aggregation, sounds great in theory, and one thing that we want to be very careful to avoid is unwarranted cost shifting to other sections of different ratepayer classes. When one leaves the system, for example, even with direct access right now in the state of Oregon, there's transition charges that large industrial customers have to pay for at least a certain set of years when they choose to leave a utility system that can effectively hold other customer classes harmless, at least for a period. But at the end of that, there's a hole in the load that the utility had previously planned for. And so to the extent that we can minimize those cost shifts or foresee them or otherwise just kind of abate them, I think that that's definitely an important consideration to make as we move forward with expanding direct access, green tariffs, and community choice aggregation. I was going to speak a little bit more in the context of residential customers and the choices that they're currently given. As Wendy said too, customer choice really depends on what kind of customer you're talking about. And for residential customers, and in the context of the SB 978 process, we would love to see increased options for demand response, such as household water heaters and managed charging for electric vehicles as they continue penetration in the grid, advanced technologies like AMIs and distributed generation such as rooftop solar at the residential level. We think this modernized grid of the future that I keep alluding to will be able to utilize some of those advanced technologies to write algorithms and control loads in ways that can flow both ways, with similar ease as how we can build supply right now. And so we think that the more accessible that these technologies are, barriers towards adoption will continue to be brought down and increased system benefits will be realized. Like I mentioned once again, kind of putting downward pressure on rates for the system as a whole. So we'd like to see the SB 978 process explore maybe different pilot options to roll out various DR, DER, DG, EV, I don't know how many acronyms I can throw out, but different options going forward. And so also looking into creative ways to incent or compensate customers for these customer-sided distributed energy resources. There are many different options to consider going forward while looking at these pilot projects. What's the role of demand response versus storage at the residential? How can we creatively integrate EVs utilizing managed charging? So we think that SB 978 and the dockets that spin off it should look at creative ways to provide residential customers with a suite of options going forward. Get them compensated for the options that they have on their side of the meter at their home, and benefit the system as a whole. For example, if we're trying to balance and firm up intermittent renewable resources, you can build a new peaking gas plant, or you can maybe utilize some of these advanced technologies that create flexibility in the system and allow the grid to flow in two different ways. And we think that the residential customers are going to be an integral part of that going forward, and we'd like to see that be part of the discussion in this process.
And Julie.
Customer choice.
Customer choice.
I wish I had something really clever to say about customer choice, but I'll just make an observation from my perspective at the commission, which is, isn't it fascinating that customers can have choice with such a large product? This is such a trend that we should be exploring as part of 978. I just say it like that because that's one of the big things that we're supposed to explore in the bill is like how trends and policy drivers are changing the existing system. And if you think about how utilities have operated in the past, they've offered vanilla ice cream, and that was your choice. And even where we exist now in the current system, customers have some level of choice, right? The residential customers have access to the portfolio options, which you mentioned, which is a renewable energy certificate-based program. Large and industrial customers have access to direct access. PGE has a lot of pilot programs around demand response. Pacific Power also has pilot programs around demand response, but those are for large customers. But the utilities are trying their hand at providing customer choice through the existing system. So I think one of the things that will be very interesting to come out of 978 is should there be a broader opening of the door to greater customer choice? Should individual customers be able to make decisions about not just what shade their energy is, so green energy, but that they want to pay more at a certain time of day, or they want to provide services to the grid. So I think that's really fascinating. Just like we're living in such an interesting time where that transition is actually happening now, where you as an electric customer could one day make choices about your electricity. That's fascinating. It hasn't occurred before.
So Franco, I left you for last here. It sounds like Julie thinks you mostly serve vanilla ice cream. I'm curious.
No, I mean in the past. Now you have
We've
sprinkles.
got vanilla, we've got chocolate,
Yeah.
we've got fish food, we've got Cherry Garcia.
There we go.
You name it.
It's like
you want something special, we'll
it's
make
like
it.
Baskin Robbins.
And sprinkles.
And sprinkles. You get
So,
toppings.
particularly in light of obviously the city of Portland and Multnomah County's goals, I'm just curious to get your take on this, and in particular, would PG like to have more opportunity to offer choice to their customers, and to what extent do you see barriers in place now that maybe SB 978 could address, or you could at least be explored through this process?
Sure. So I guess it's a great question to have after the equity discussion, because it's really important that we make sure that the word choice isn't hijacked for like a veil to discriminate against different customer classes, and I think Wendy and Mike brought that up sufficiently. So we're always looking at choice through the lens of our kind of foundational imperatives: safe, reliable, affordable. We've talked about clean and equitable as well here today. There's also a question of when choices are made. So you mentioned City of Portland, Multnomah County with their 100% resolutions. They made a choice. They told us through that they want to go to 100% renewable. That's a pretty good signal to a utility or a service provider that they need to figure out how they're going to support one of their significant customers. We've also, as a state, made a choice to have a regulated system that provides an opportunity for transparency. It provides an opportunity for conversation for these other groups to come in and get involved. So, we make choice up front, and then we need to make sure that stays connected to the choices at the back end. So, whenever there are arguments about, there's no choice in Oregon, I feel like it's too narrowly centered. We're the original community choice aggregator, if you think about it. We're providing the type of energy and service that the customers are asking for through an aggregated system that minimizes the cost for everybody. So, we also want to make sure that competition and things like deregulation don't end up in a place like we're seeing today with net neutrality, where you might have universal access, everybody has access, but you don't get the same speed on your internet, you don't get to see the same websites unless you pay more. That's not the type of system that we want to end up with in the state. As far as the technology choices, rooftop solar, we think it's great. We think there are good values to being able to have the two-way system. A lot of the work that we're doing now is around enabling that system to happen. It's kind of a three-phased approach where we maintain the current system, enable the interconnection of the technologies and future tools that are going to be out there, and then transform the system to be able to have an optimized conversation. And the keys to that are having an entity that is able to have visibility and control of some of those resources, and to appropriately compensate the people who own the resources for their use, but so that you can optimize around the system, so you're not building extra lines where you don't need them when you could otherwise shift energy around. So kind of veering away from choice a little bit, but the big takeaway is that our customers today do have a choice, and that optimized system is going to enable more choice for them in the future. Oh yeah, and we filed today for a green tariff. So we're excited to offer another flavor of ice cream with our customers once that goes through the commission process.
Thanks.
Hot fudge.
Hot fudge. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was is that a topping or a different flavor? I'm not sure. But we have 10 or 15 minutes left. I wanted to stop talking and give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. This SB 978 kind of puts everything on the table. So I'm curious to hear what folks in the room are thinking and particular questions they have for the group.
Hi, Tanya Barham with PECI, and I hope this won't be too provocative of a question, but I'll put that out there as my disclaimer. I think Franco and Mike kind of danced around this, and then Mike started going for it a little bit toward the end of his last comment, and that is, we know that if we have this vertically integrated utility, there's some benefit to that socialization of that infrastructure cost, and that in the past 150 years, utilities have gotten really good at deploying capital very efficiently. But when we think about what is the capital that we're deploying, I think to Mike's point, there's going to be a whole paradigm shift in this intermittent, instead of generation following load, load has to follow generation. So what is the infrastructure that can provide that generation following load? And it's not going to be wires and big solar PV plants or big wind plants. We see what happened in California with that. You get the duck curve. So will utilities start funding hundreds of thousands of water heaters and EVs, and will that go into the rate base? To Mike's point, will we start funding broadband and communications at the distribution level and technologies across a wide scale that can allow distributed and communicating entities to balance load and generation across a region as opposed to through intermediary?
Any volunteers to get started with that one?
Yeah, happy to. It's a great question. I think there's two questions in there. One is, what are the technologies and systems needed to have the opportunity for load to follow generation? And then two is, how do you pay for it? And so I'm going to try not to dance around it. The work that we're doing now with our grid modernization efforts are intended to provide that system to allow for load to follow generation. And then coupled with that, we'll be piloting programs on more demand response, time of use pilots, to figure out how we can provide the right signals to people to be able to use their load flexibly. As far as smart water heaters, we've got programs and incentives for that as well. How much the utility has a responsibility to kind of drive those with dollars versus enable their operation by providing a smart grid that is able to take signals from there and communicate with it, I think is part of the pathways discussion. If you haven't seen it yet, I definitely encourage you to take a look at our deep decarbonization study. It's on our website, and happy to give you more information to exactly where it is after this.
I want to follow up to that real quick, and just the perspective of the panelists, and I guess mostly for Franco, do you see any barriers with the current regulatory system incentivizing, with the incentives pushing you more towards more centralized assets as opposed to kind of these more distributed solutions and hot water heaters and dynamic loads and demand response? And I'm just curious to get your comments on whether you think, to bring it back to 978, really it's a regulatory incentive question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comment that was made earlier about the system being set up to deploy capital for the large infrastructure needs as electricity usage was expanding was a good paradigm. I think there's still value in that as we modernize the grid. And I think there's a good opportunity to think about how we incentivize different aspects of the system as it evolves. So trying to think of a specific example where like a performance-based regulation would be interesting, but maybe that's something to think about in the 978 context.
Take one more comment from the panel on this, and then we'll go back to the room for a question.
I was just going to say, since you work for PECI, for all of the folks that work with building owners and people that are going to have to participate in these programs, so I've had some people say to me, well, as long as the utility gives the price signal, people will participate. And I'm not sure that's true. So I think that this is not only a challenge for the utility, but it's a challenge for everybody in this room, that we need to get better at communicating to the customers that need to install the water heater that has the enabling technology, and be comfortable with the idea that the utility, make sure that we are communicating and educating the public who's going to need to participate in all of these. Every study after study after study show that demand response and those abilities is really important to the future of our grid and to keeping costs affordable for people. And that is a huge education challenge. We see that with energy efficiency. It reduces bills for everybody who does it, but we still have a lot of people who haven't taken the steps to do it. And I fear that the same will be true with demand response if we don't get ahead of that curve and really do the education that we need. I don't think it's going to be sufficient just to have the utility offering a price signal. So I think that's another area where I'm glad that the new groups are coming in so that they can be emissaries to different groups of customers to talk to them about this. And, we need to be thinking about how all of our groups can participate in educating people and getting them comfortable with the ideas and getting them to say yes.
I was going to dovetail and add to that I think this conversation does at least raise the specter of, should various regulatory models be examined that are less reliant on the utility deploying capital and perhaps compensating it more in its role as a manager of its system and balancing it. So kind of in my hypothetical example earlier, let's say we have a utility that has a $100 million revenue requirement. If the distribution system level investment that we might see in the future is going to be less than the larger generation and transmission that we're seeing right now, we could maybe tie 50 million of that to capital investment, 30 million to rate stability, just different metrics that we can look at with how the utility can utilize this suite of distributed energy resources within its system and compensate it for it and provide it the rate of return that it needs to fulfill its fiduciary duty for its shareholders, but in a creative way that kind of takes into reality what the future might look like.
Looking to the room for any more questions.
Hi, Jason Searbin, Oregon Department of Energy. This is just echoing a little bit, maybe adding a little bit to the comments on choice that we were talking about. I think it's an interesting observation to see, to look at choice and see how we're kind of in this infant stage of choices increasing. but to also acknowledge that there's probably a tipping point where you can reach like this paradox of choice, it's kind of called sometimes, being overwhelmed by too many choices. And so my only observation would be, and my only comment would be to kind of keep our eyes on that and simplify when possible. And I think one of the spots where this could kind of fit into the landscape was smart grid and maybe automating some of those choices to optimize them as best we can, but still letting people have their choice on some things. But you've got so many options out there. There is kind of breaking ground right now. Time of use pricing, that's an option. Picking your green portfolio or your pricing plan and things like that. So it's interesting.
Completely agree. It made me think of going to the grocery store down the chip aisle. It's been way too much time trying to pick one of those things.
I think within that, just to add a little bit more flavor, is that we need to realize that even not all residential customers are the same, right? Renters versus homeowners, folks that have installed smart thermostats in their homes, folks that have an EV, folks that are thinking about putting PV panels on, versus those that live in multifamily dwellings and are only there for perhaps a year. So different choices, you know, pertain to different profiles of customers throughout the board too. So even more choices out there.
So I think this is really emblematic of, I think it's a point well taken that it's, there probably is some interest in expanding choices, but yet at the same time simplifying to making those choices easier for customers, and that's a really tall order. And that's kind of emblematic, I think, of a lot of these issues in SB 978. It's a tough task the PUC has, so I don't envy them, and they're doing a great job. But you know, it's kind of dealing with this ever complex industry that's growing ever more complex, and trying to manage that complexity in a way that's simple for customers is a real challenge. I think we had another question here.
Bonneville Power, Portland Ratepayer. I have unlimited minutes now on my phone, and we've seen price per minute would come down, and eventually went to these unlimited plans. Are we maybe seeing a future where we have unlimited plans for energy, and I can plug in my car, plug in all my other needs, and pay less than I am now, because we're seeing a surplus of energy coming onto the grid, and maybe being able to utilize that in a way that reduces carbon, gets us to a more greener future, and reduces prices for consumers.
But you still pay for data.
I'm going to say, so as an organization that is always talking about energy efficiency and how we need to ensure that the system is as efficient as possible, I'm going to say I sure hope not. I think that it's a completely different situation. There may be times where on the grid we have a surplus of energy that we need to soak up, but that's not universally true at any moment of any day. And so I hope we don't get to a point where we just have people plugging in and not charged based on how much energy they use, because I think that could have disastrous consequences. I think the energy system needs to price according to the specific circumstances of the utilities, and I think it's just a different situation.
Commissioner Decker mentioned cost causation. We want to make sure that stays in effect. I don't know, I'm not going to disclose how much I pay Sprint and Comcast every month, but I'm getting a pretty sweet deal for my electricity, and I can do a lot of things with that besides just look at my phone and watch TV. So I agree, it's a different paradigm. To the extent that efficiencies help us maintain costs and those costs go down, I think that's great. And I've been wrong about a lot of things before, and technology is just like exponentially changing things. So I won't say it won't happen, but it needs to be done in a thoughtful way so that it's continues to be equitable and affordable for everybody.
That's the extreme example, and I think what will be some type of banding in between, and then more choice too, so that you have a hydropower product that's like fully dedicated for fish and wildlife, compared to another carbon-based system that doesn't necessarily capture those externalities. How do customers choose between all these different things? I mean, I've got green source, which is wind and solar, but what about maybe large-scale hydro? Is that another choice that has a value? And then some other energy sources have their value. People need to choose between those, and different flavors of vanilla with different toppings.
I like the ice cream analogies. I don't know if there's dessert here, but maybe one more question. We have about 30 seconds left, I think, if the clock is right there.
Yeah, right over here.
Yeah. Michael Dembro again.
So, we've been talking a lot about the planning for electrification of transportation. I'm sure that's on everybody's minds. What I haven't heard a lot about is electrification of home heating. And, I know that, the PUC regulates both Northwest Natural and, Avista, as well as electricity. And, we, as we're working to put a price on carbon to internalize those costs, we see pathways for doing that under, with reasonable cost increases on the electricity side. But on the gas side, it's a real challenge. And I'm just wondering how you're planning, how the PUC is planning for the eventual future of Northwest Natural and the gas part of Avista.
Thank you, Senator Dembro, for that extremely hard question.
And we're out of time. Thank you.
I would just say that is an extremely difficult question to answer from the perspective of the commission. That I know that that's something that the natural gas utilities are working towards and thoroughly investigating. But they haven't made any sort of filing at the commission about their projections for the future. So.
It's a very well put question, and it's actually the question we didn't get to here that I had written down was along these lines of it's challenging for the PUC to, I think, figure out the right metrics and the way to evaluate these kind of cross-sector issues, and I think it's a really challenging one, and I think there's a real need for, I think, some technical analysis. Was it PNNL or just earlier this week talking about this, if they can bring some analysis to help I think put some data analysis around this issue in terms of our long-term climate goals and how we have to address these other sectors. So, but I think we're now over time, so thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. Let them get down, I think. Okay, we are going to move straight into our final speaker of the day. It's my honor to introduce to you guys Jessica Shipley. She has a degree in environmental economics as well as a master's degree in public policy from Berkeley. She's worked across the country from the Oregon Department of Energy all the way to the British Embassy, and she's currently with the Regulatory Assistance Project. So here's Jessica Shipley.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this really excellent event for asking me to speak here today. So you just heard a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know, the Regulatory Assistance Project, we're a global nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We work with energy and environment regulators and stakeholders on some of the tricky issues we've been talking about today in the power sector. So it's 4:03. I'm keenly aware that I'm standing between you and the reception, and also you and your weekend, I just realized. So I want to thank you for sticking around with me for the next 30 minutes or so. So there's been some really excellent speakers today. In fact, you guys are really hard to follow. So I just want to commend all of the speakers that we've heard today and also the organizers for just pulling together such a great event. And I think if there's one thing that's clear to me from today's speakers and panels is that we have the knowledge and the expertise right here in Oregon to deal with some of the challenges and also harness the trends and the opportunities that we have coming. So that's really exciting. I'm hoping to close out today with perhaps a high-level perspective on 4 main topics. The energy technology changes and the implications. Lots of this has been touched on already today, but I want to reinforce some of those points. The broader policy landscape in which we are seeing these changes, a win-win-win scenario that we see developing for the grid, for consumers, and for the environment. And then just some closing thoughts on harnessing these trends and these opportunities. So first, I want to talk about the big picture technology trends. Director Benner and other speakers have already done a great job today highlighting so many of these. So I just want to reinforce a few things. As we've been hearing, the energy sector is seeing exponential change, as Franco just said, in terms of cost and capabilities of technology. And I think exponential is kind of an overused word, since I just use it again. But so let me be clear what I mean by that. And I think Moore's law is kind of a good example of what we mean when we say exponential, which is reflecting a regular doubling in computing power. And in the energy sector, we're seeing doublings in the absolute sense, so in installations of solar and wind technologies, in the capability sense, being able to go further on a charge of an EV, and also in a cost sense, so a regular halving of the market price for different technologies. And we've seen an influx of data about the grid, especially with the advent of smart meters and other technologies that are showing us where things are happening on the grid and when. We've heard about renewable energy just exploding in solar and wind grid parity. We're seeing end uses of energy start to be electrified and be added to that grid. And we have storage and EV capabilities really taking off. So these forces are compounding each other due to the digitization of energy and creating network effects. So we're starting to be able to manage our electricity demand in ways that we never have been able to before. So recall, Uber and Lyft didn't provide better cars necessarily than Yellow Cab. And Airbnb certainly doesn't always provide me a better hotel room than I could get from Hilton. But it's really that information that's enabled these new companies to come onto the scene and provide better services and more convenient services to customers. So to go back to Janine's wave analogy from earlier today, I think if I turn my head on the side, this kind of looks like a scary wave. We're somewhere in the middle there. We don't know, exactly where we are, but we sure know that there's more of this to come in the future. So I wanted to look at some of the trends in a little bit of detail. I think I'm actually going to skip over this one because I think it was covered really well by Janine earlier. But pause here because I heard this might be something like Janine's favorite chart. I'm not sure, but it's not quite. No, okay. So this is just showing the technology cost declines in wind that we've seen since 1980 to 2012, over a 10 times price decline from over 50 cents a kilowatt hour to 5 cents in 2012. And this has really continued over the last 6 years. Some of you might know Bloomberg New Energy Finance reports out the global best deals on an unsubsidized basis for various types of technologies. So this is really the least cost and least risk investment globally for these technologies. In 2015, that was 6 cents for solar in the United Arab Emirates and about 4.5 cents for wind in various places in the US. And you fast forward 2 years and we have 1.8 cents for solar in Saudi Arabia and 2 cents for wind in India. So just a couple of years and some serious cost declines in these technologies. So this is happening here in the US too, of course, as you know. In December of last year, Xcel Energy in Colorado reported out the results of their all-source competitive procurement process. So this was 238 projects that bid into this competitive solicitation, about 60,000 megawatts. And I want to give you just an idea of what some of the bids looked like in this process. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that solar was coming in at an average of $30 a megawatt hour, or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Wind was coming in at an average of $18 a megawatt hour, or less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And so if we compare that to the operating costs of traditional power plants, which is what's on the right-hand side of this slide, so EIA reports out the variable operating costs of different types of power plants on a national average basis. In 2016, coal cost about $37 a megawatt hour for fuel and operating costs. Gas was lower at about 30, and nuclear was lower still at about 25. But these are just averages, remember, so about half the units are actually costing more than these amounts here. And those are the plants that are really at risk of becoming economically obsolete, because wind is coming in at less than the fuel costs alone of coal and gas, and solar for less than the operating costs of coal and on par with gas. So what does that mean for utilities? Well, it means that a utility that even has plenty of capacity could actually think about purchasing renewable energy to reduce fuel costs and therefore reduce customer bills. In fact, going forward, it means that utilities that aren't looking at purchasing renewable energy are maybe leaving cost savings on the table for customers, which is a really profound change in the way that we've thought about the cost of new technologies. As you've heard from others today, the cost of other technologies are coming down too. I think if I had to pick a favorite chart, this might be mine. This is showing you lithium-ion battery costs as an example here. On the y-axis is the dollars per kilowatt hour of energy coming out of the battery, and the blue triangles there are showing you the actual observed prices through 2016, and then Bloomberg's projections going out into the future for how costs are going to continue to come down. And they actually just updated really recently, so I couldn't get this slide changed, their projection for when the unsubsidized price of EVs is going to pass the price of internal combustion vehicles. So this shows they were projecting 2025, and they just changed that to 2024. Greg mentioned, I think, Goldman Sachs projections being even earlier than this, so maybe Bloomberg is a little behind the times. But and so some of the technology trends that we're seeing are maybe looking like they might occur on a slightly longer time scale than the EV example I just gave. And one example of that is going to be on this slide. I promise not to throw too many more numbers on you after 4. But I think this one is just really interesting because it's pretty new. So NREL just completed this analysis of heat pump technology for space and water heating. And these are the results for the levelized cost of service in dollars per MBTU of heating output of heat pumps for water heating versus some other technology options. So in 2020, they're projecting that heat pumps are going to be roughly on par with a gas water heater and obviously cheaper than an electric resistance water heater in terms of the useful heating output that this technology can produce. By 2050, NREL is projecting that the heat pump is actually going to be $12 cheaper than the gas water heater in terms of dollars per heating output. And it's actually the only technology up here that is declining in cost over time. So this is, just another example of some of the changes that I think we're going to see coming in terms of what consumers are going to be asking for and wanting. So the implications of these trends, there are probably many, and several have already been mentioned today, but here are 3 that I see. This newly available flexible load that we've been hearing about means that consumers can now better manage their energy use, and there's new tools for grid managers, like we were just hearing from Franco. Declining power sector carbon emissions are a key implication of these changes we see. And the new abundance of data and information about the grid is really bringing an information revolution to energy. So I want to look at these 3 really briefly here. As has been talked about, many of these new consumer choices represent flexible load opportunities. So until now, we've pretty much had to consume electricity when it was produced. And that's changing with these new technologies that are available. So for example, a water heater really only needs to run 2 to 3 hours a day in order for there to be enough hot water in the tank for your typical single-family home consumer. With these new grid integration controls, those hours can be controlled into the low-cost or low-emission times of the day. And this is going to add value to the grid and to other consumers, other customers. So if a consumer is willing and able to be flexible about when they use the grid to heat up their water, they can save money on their energy bill if they have that option from their utility, or they can be compensated by the utility for the service that they provide to the grid if that option is available to them. And there's similar options that are coming, are actually available already to control HVAC and EVs as well. The changes that we're seeing in energy generation technology are leading to declining power sector carbon emissions, which is really an important trend, and I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes here. And lastly, the sheer quantity of information now that we have about energy use and the ease with which utilities, third parties, and customers themselves can access it is really what I think is driving so much of this transformation that we're seeing. So for the past 100 years, we've pretty much had to manage supply to meet demand, as we've been hearing today. We had to build a grid that had a lot of redundancy built in order to do that, because we couldn't manage our use as precisely as we can today. And on top of this, many devices and buildings now often have energy controls built in. So what that means is the customers can just be passive, actually, and get a lot of the benefits from this technology. So this chart is from Cisco Systems, and they're projecting that by 2021, half of all device connections will be machine to machine. And so that's the M2M blue bar that you see on this chart. So this means that technology is actually going to be able to talk to one another and not really need intervention from the customer itself. This is really what I think is going to enable this cheaper, cleaner, and more precisely managed energy grid in the future. So of course, all of these trends are occurring against a backdrop of policy, regulatory, and market changes. Lots have been talked about today. The process at the PUC is exploring many of them. I want to just talk about a few before I move on to talking about the opportunity that we see for the win-win-win scenario. The first is this consensus around the need to decarbonize the economy really quickly. There's a near consensus around the pathways that we need to take to get there. And of course, here in Oregon, this conversation is ongoing with your discussions about how to meet the state's carbon goals. Globally, there's more studies than I can even name off or keep track of that have been done with different types of modeling tools, and pretty much they all have come to roughly the same conclusion, which is that if we're going to meet our decarbonization goals, we need an aggressive three-pronged strategy, a doubling down on energy efficiency efforts, electrification of a wide range of energy end uses, and we need pretty much a decarbonized power sector. So this is a global trend, and pretty much all of these studies kind of point to the same conclusion. And there's a related trend that we're seeing in state regulatory and environmental bodies around the country, as well as legislatures, which is really a push for electrification, particularly of transportation, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. There's a number of drivers of this. There are the customers, of course, that want an EV or want this technology. It's that technology cost coming down and making it just cheaper and better for customers. And there's the recognition of the environmental benefits that I think is starting to really pick up around the country. So in 2017, there were only 7 states that didn't take some sort of action on electric vehicles. And there's a real diversity in the types of actions that states are taking. This is a list of some of the types. You're seeing states like Maryland, Ohio, and Illinois are looking at EVs through a sort of a broader grid modernization effort. Others are seeing utilities actually come forward with electric vehicle rate designs and tariffs, like Rocky Mountain Power in Utah. And then many states, including Oregon, of course, are exploring how to grow the EV market particularly through increasing charging infrastructure and access to charging infrastructure. So the next several years are just looking super interesting and busy on this front in the state legislatures and regulatory bodies. And the last thing I want to touch on here is Western grid regionalization. It's been brought up a couple of times today. There are conversations going on right now among various entities that may want to provide grid and market services to utilities and states in the West. And it is becoming clear that this is going to be a key piece of grid balancing going forward in the West. For example, there was a day just recently in February that the California ISO had a really challenging system peak that they had to deal with, and they're reporting that on that day they met 62% of the ramp up in the early evening hours with imports. So there's an indication that regional resources are really already playing a really important role in grid balancing. And it appears that the benefits of these types of exchanges are really real. As you probably all know, the California ISO operates their 5-minute energy supply and demand balancing market, the EIM. In addition to the cost savings that the ISO is reporting from the EIM, there's also significant emission reductions that are starting to materialize. So Pacific Corps, this chart is from them, they are reporting that their system emissions are down 14% since joining the EIM in November of 2014. So where are all of these technology and policy trends leading us? Well, at RAP, we and others in the energy policy community, and lots of you here today, have talked about an opportunity that we think can achieve significant benefits for consumers, for the management of the grid, and therefore the increasing integration of variable renewables, and environmental benefits such as reduced carbon emissions. So we call this win-win-win. Beneficial electrification, but others are using other terms to talk about similar opportunities. Now, some might think this is all about load growth. So there's this report last year from the Brattle Group that imagined that electrification could nearly double utility sales by 2050. But we don't think that's where things are headed. If you look at the fundamentals of where the power sector is today, so this is a really busy chart, but I just want you to focus on the blue line, which is showing you the annual growth rate in electricity use in the US going back to 1950. And this is basically just showing this clear trend that growth in electricity use is declining. And also, it's decoupling itself from GDP growth, which is what's in the red line there. So the trend is pretty clear, and the projections, both from EIA and also from the Northwest Power and Planning Council, as was mentioned earlier, are that load growth is flat or declining going out into the future. So we're seeing these trends, and we do think that electrification presents opportunities for utilities, certainly, but it's not just about restoring load growth. RAP believes that if electrification is going to be beneficial, it needs to meet certain conditions. So we think it should meet one of these three conditions at least without adversely affecting the other two. And those conditions are that it save consumers money over the long term, that it enable better grid management and therefore increase integration of renewables, and reduce environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions. So this is how we talk about whether a measure should qualify as beneficial electrification or not. And what I want to do now is just walk you through some simple explanation of how these different conditions play out if they're done right. So the first one, saving consumers money. Because the efficiency with which these new technologies use energy, consumers can save money by switching to an electric end use. So this is just a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation for the fuel cost savings of switching to an EV. Probably don't need to tell anybody in this room that if you assume roughly $2.40 a gallon for gas and 13 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity, this consumer could save $450 a year from switching to an EV. Now, this picture probably looks better in Oregon because our electricity costs are lower than the national average, 13 cents, roughly what that was when we made this slide. And things are looking pretty good over the life of these technologies as well. This just shows the first 100,000 miles of a Nissan Leaf versus a Honda Civic. The crossover point you can see is occurring there somewhere around the 50,000 mile mark. But again, this analysis doesn't include the Oregon incentive for a purchase of an EV. So the Leaf probably looks a lot better in Oregon than this chart shows. So now I'm going to turn to the second condition of the three that we think are important to beneficial electrification, and that is enabling better grid management. So because as we've heard, these new technologies represent flexible sources of load, they can provide value to the grid. They can help fill in these dips in frequency throughout the day and also shave off system peaks and shift them to later in the day, perhaps when there's less stress on the grid. So take, for example, this uncontrolled electric water heating load. The red spikes show you when the water heater came on over the course of a 24-hour day. I think most notably the largest and longest spike is occurring right at 6 p.m., which is probably when the rest of the system was peaking, which means that the water heater was running probably during the most expensive and dirtiest time of the day for it to be running. If it was a heat pump water heater with controls built in, it could have actually shifted its load to a different time of the day, perhaps to when the solar panels on the roof were producing clean and cheaper energy. And this availability of flexible load is becoming ever more important as there's increasing amounts of renewables on the system. We're probably mostly all familiar with the California ISO duck curve. It shows the net load throughout a 24-hour period. And that dip in the middle of the day there is due to the increasing amounts of solar on the system. And the California ISO predicted by the latter part of this decade there was going to be this very significant belly in the middle of the day, leading to a very challenging ramp up in the early evening hours. And it turns out their predictions are coming true about 4 years early. So in February of this year, they reported an actual net load of 7,000 megawatts, and in March, an actual ramp, a 3-hour ramp of over 14,000 megawatts. So these are real grid management challenges that we have today that flexible load can start to help address. So in this California example, say we had controlled EV charging at work, or we were able to shift some of that water heating load to the middle of the day. That can start to help it fill in that belly. And if we can use smart charging controls to prevent some of our charging in the early evening when everybody's getting home from work and wants to turn on the lights and the oven or whatever else you turn on, you can actually start to shift some sources of load from those system peak hours and over to the valleys. So this flexible demand can decrease the size of that ramp, which is really the challenging thing about this for grid managers. And so we'll be able to integrate increasing amounts of renewable energy onto the grid. So turning to the third condition for beneficial electrification from RAP's perspective is that it reduces environmental impacts. In this context, this means that the emissions of the grid with the electrification measure are going to be less or cleaner than the emissions of whatever the alternative thing is that we're replacing it with. So declining power sector emissions, as I mentioned earlier, and the increased efficiency of these devices is actually meaning that heat pumps and EVs, things like that, are either already are or they're very close to becoming cleaner than their fossil fuel powered alternatives. And this is just an illustrative diagram to show you what I mean by that. It's showing that electric devices like the heat pump water heater is eventually getting cleaner than the alternative as the grid cleans up. So the important thing is over time, as the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, these technologies are actually surpassing the alternatives that they might be replacing. And this is really the technological truism that is leading so many of those deep decarbonization studies to say that electrification is such an important piece of any strategy to meet those carbon goals. And there are other environmental public health benefits that can be achieved as well, in addition to reducing carbon. This is an analysis from Columbia University on the impact of electrifying buses in New York City. This study found, it's a little hard to tell, but the life cycle costs of the electric bus without the yellow bar are actually cheaper than the diesel bus. But when you add in the costs of the health impacts of diesel emissions, the electric bus is far superior to the diesel bus over its life cycle. The only barrier to the electric bus is that upfront cost. So we should really be exploring how to overcome this barrier, because that yellow bar represents significant benefits to society that we should be figuring out how to capture. So how can we harness these trends and opportunities to achieve societal goals? I want to leave you with just a few thoughts on this before wrapping up. I'm probably going to pose more questions than answers here, but hopefully it'll give you some food for thought as we move on to the reception and out into the rest of our daily lives. And the first idea I have for you to think about is the implications of comprehensive carbon policy like Cap and Invest for our ability to achieve that win-win-win scenario for customers, for the grid, and for the environment. So for example, if there's a price on carbon, how would that affect how the PUC would evaluate something like a transportation electrification proposal? If there's increased EV adoption, there's likely to be increased electricity use, which very well may lead to increased emissions from the electric sector, while emissions from the petroleum are declining by more than that amount. So there's an overall benefit to the state because overall emissions are declining. And so I think as we evaluate these programs going forward, perhaps in a system where we do have a cap and trade or cap and invest market, we need to account for that decreased petroleum use as a benefit of these programs. And also we want to make sure that we're, encouraging these programs to use smart charging so that the EVs are charging at low emission times of the grid and we're getting the most bang for our buck out of these programs. The second thing is to think about how well our existing energy policies are working and whether they're taking us where we want to go. So this is something we've just sort of started talking about with states around the country when we're talking about electrification. And that is, do policies that strictly encourage the reduction of kilowatt hours of electricity really achieve the societal goal that we're shooting for? Or should we be thinking about adding other metrics like perhaps overall energy use or maybe emissions? The third question that I want to pose here is, do our existing regulatory structures enable customer demand to provide grid services? So are we capturing the benefits of this newly available flexible demand? This has been touched on a little bit so far today, but I think a meaningful price signal is really important for this. So there's tons of research that shows that customers will shift their use of the grid to be used in a beneficial way for all ratepayers if they're given that meaningful price signal. And on these last 2 points, I was really encouraged to see that PGE proposed and the PUC approved that the company is going to come forward with a residential EV charging pilot that's going to include rebates for level 2 chargers, which are much more efficient than level 1 chargers, and also a time of use rate schedule for those customers that do go onto that program. And finally, many of you are already engaged, as we've heard, in asking the big picture questions about our utility structures that we have in place and whether they're adequate for where we want to go. As was mentioned, many states are looking at some of these big questions. Deciding the role of the utility in the future and how they're going to earn revenue is a conversation that is ongoing. It's happening around the country. We're seeing states in restructured environments look at performance-based rate making like New York and Rhode Island. States in vertically integrated markets like Hawaii and Minnesota are asking very similar questions. And I think one of the biggest takeaways so far from those states that have gone forward with this is that it really pays to get out in front and start having these conversations when you're not in crisis mode. So Oregon can be really proud of the efforts that you have ongoing with Senate Bill 978. You're on a short list of states that are sort of just now embarking on this process. And also you're getting a lot of national attention. So I just want to say keep up the good work there, and everybody's really interested to see where you go. So I want to close by observing something about how energy policy gets done in Oregon, and that is to reiterate the point that I just made about collaboration, which I think has been a key aspect of so many of the successes that we've had here. And so just to name a few, I know they've been named earlier today, but I think these are just so important and so noteworthy. The agreement to close the Boardman coal plant so much earlier than it was regularly scheduled to close. This is not an achievement that very many states can claim. There was the diverse group of stakeholders that worked together to pass Senate Bill 1547 and increase the state's RPS. And then, of course, 978 is really an opportunity to just continue that spirit of collaboration. So I guess I would just say I think there are plenty of challenges ahead. We've touched on so many of them today, but we've certainly shown the willingness and the ability here in Oregon to take on those challenges. I'm very, very proud to tell people who I interact with in my new role that I'm from Oregon. So I want to thank you so much for your hard work and your leadership on these issues. And thank you for listening and staying. And I look forward to chatting with you at the reception. So I think I'm heading back to Caitlin maybe.
Thank you. That works perfectly. All right, so instead of having a Q&A at this time, Jessica Shipley has agreed to stay for the reception and answer any of your questions that you have for her at that time. And so I want to take this time to thank all of you for attending our 11th annual symposium, co-sponsored with the ENR Center today. In addition, thank you to all of our speakers for contributing to this ever-increasingly important topic, not only for Oregon or the Pacific Northwest, but for setting the tone for the future of energy in the United States. Specifically, I would like us all to join in thanking Professor Dotson for all of his help and contributions to making this event possible. So if we could all give him a round of hand. And finally, thank you to the ENR Center, fellow members of GBI, and everyone involved in making today a success. Please join us for the reception, and thank you again for attending.